66 million years ago, Earth's nights over the oceans were both familiar and alien. A nearly full moon hung above the curved horizon, its light sliding across a warm, shallow sea that covered wide areas of the continents. In the darkness below, each movement stirred tiny flashes of blue-green, as planktonic organisms released brief pulses of light. The surface appeared to breathe, glowing and fading as waves rolled in long, quiet lines. In this late stage of the Cretaceous, the planet's seas were high and expansive. The Western Interior Seaway split North America into two long islands, while the Tethys Ocean wrapped around low-lying continental margins. These waters were not empty. Silhouettes passed beneath the moonlit surface, the sweeping tail of a mosasaur, the distant outline of a long-necked plesiosaur rising to breathe, the slow, steady shadow of a giant turtle crossing a flooded plain where land had once stood. Far above this scene, beyond the thin shell of atmosphere and far past the reach of the brightest stars, a different body moved in silence. A large asteroid, deflected long before by gravitational encounters, was already on its way toward the planet. During this time, nothing in the water revealed its approach. The surface remained calm, the glowing plankton still drifted, and the great marine reptiles continued their routines, unaware that their era was entering its final moments. The oceans of the final Cretaceous are often imagined as arenas of constant violence, filled with perpetual chases and sudden attacks. In reality, most days were dominated by slower rhythms and stable food webs. Over time, these seas had become rich, layered habitats, where short bursts of predation were surrounded by long periods of cruising, resting, and feeding. As a result, large predators and gentle filter feeders shared the same broad environments, each occupying a distinct niche. Mosasaurs, some longer than a city bus, patrolled the midwaters of seaways and open shelves. Long-necked elasmosaurid plesiosaurs lifted small heads to the air, then vanished again into schools of fish that shimmered like shifting clouds. Giant turtles moved between coastal shallows and deeper channels. Ammonites, with coiled shells that caught the moonlight near the surface, rose and fell in the water column. Filter-feeding sharks strained plankton from passing currents, while immense swarms of smaller fish and microscopic organisms formed the foundation of these ecosystems. This episode will move through time and scale to reach this nocturnal scene. It will begin with Earth's earlier history, when continents and oceans were still arranging into the patterns of the late Cretaceous. It will then narrow to the last Cretaceous seas themselves, explore daily life in different regions, and finally follow the chain of events that turned thriving habitats into extinction zones. What would it be like to drift at the surface of the Western Interior Seaway on a quiet night, hearing only distant splashes and the soft crackle of life in the water? How would the gentle push of warm waves, the dim shapes of plesiosaurs below, and the faint glow of plankton feel, knowing that far above, the sky was already changing? This process of reconstruction invites a final question. If a single day could be spent snorkeling in these ancient seas, what sights, sounds, and sensations would unfold, right up to the moment the sky falls? To understand that final gentle day in the Cretaceous seas, the story must be rewound to a time when no swimmer, no wave, and no shore yet existed. Long before plesiosaurs glided through warm inland seaways, Earth was a young, violent planet, its surface closer to a furnace than to a blue world. During its earliest history, shortly after the planet formed about 4.5 billion years ago, the surface was dominated by molten rock and constant impacts. Large asteroids and early protoplanets struck with enough energy to vaporize entire regions of crust. Instead of stable continents, there were shifting plates of solidifying lava, repeatedly broken and swallowed back into the mantle. There was no breathable atmosphere, no protective ozone layer, and no trace of the calm Cretaceous oceans that would one day cover much of the globe. As the impacts gradually became less frequent, the planet began to cool. Heat still escaped from the deep interior, but a thin, unstable crust started to harden at the surface. Volcanoes erupted along enormous fractures, releasing vast amounts of gas. This process of volcanic outgassing built a dense early atmosphere rich in water vapor, carbon dioxide, and other gases. At the same time, icy comets and water-bearing minerals delivered additional water. Because of this combined input, the air around the young planet thickened and became heavy with moisture. Over time, as the uppermost crust cooled further, water vapor in the atmosphere began to condense. Clouds thickened and rain fell for very long periods, collecting in the lowest regions of the surface. These first basins filled with hot, mineral-rich water until they merged into global oceans that wrapped around the planet. Yet these early oceans were not the clear blue waters familiar from the late Cretaceous. They were likely iron-rich, sometimes greenish or murky, and dominated by dissolved metals and volcanic chemicals. Life in these ancient seas was also very different. Instead of large animals, the water was filled with microscopic organisms that used chemical reactions for energy. During this time, early forms of photosynthetic microbes began releasing oxygen into the oceans. As a result, iron dissolved in the water slowly reacted and settled to the seafloor, changing the chemistry of the oceans and preparing the way for more complex life. Could any observer then have imagined future seas ruled by marine reptiles and ammonites? While the oceans spread, the solid outer shell of the planet started to break into moving plates. Plate tectonics gradually organized the crust into early fragments of continents and deep oceanic basins. These small, buoyant cratons survived repeated collisions and rifting, later assembling into the first supercontinents and the wide, shallow seas that surrounded them. Over immense spans of time, this same system would build and destroy ocean basins again and again. The warm, epicontinental seas of the late Cretaceous, with their gentle waves and rich food webs, represent only the latest chapter in this 4 billion-year experiment in ocean making. Each earlier ocean, from the iron-laden green waters of the Archean to the broad Panthalassic realms around Pangaea, set the stage for the final Cretaceous seas. How did those last oceans arrange themselves across the continents, and what kinds of habitats did they create for the final great sea creatures before the asteroid arrived? Long before the gentle Cretaceous seaways spread across the continents, Earth passed through ages when land and ocean followed a very different pattern. During this time, the planet's surface was a restless mosaic of small fragments rather than a few broad continents. To understand how the last great sea monsters gained their habitats, it is necessary to step back into this earlier, fragmented world. In the Archean and early Proterozoic, the crust did not yet hold stable giants like modern Africa or Asia. Instead, many small proto-continents and volcanic island arcs drifted across the planet, colliding, welding together, and tearing apart again. These early fragments, called cratons, formed as heat escaped from the mantle and caused partial melting, which allowed lighter, silica-rich rocks to float and thicken. Over time, some of these cratons survived repeated collisions and began to act as seeds for later continents. Because there were no wide, continuous continents, the early oceans wrapped almost completely around the globe. Water flooded between island arcs and around scattered land, forming long, interconnected basins. The chemistry of these oceans was different. They were richer in dissolved iron and other minerals, and the atmosphere above them held little free oxygen. Sunlight was weaker, filtered through haze and volcanic gases, and life in the water consisted mainly of simple single-celled organisms. Yet the same underlying rules of plate movement already operated. Mid-ocean ridges created new crust. Subduction zones consumed old crust, and this process slowly rearranged land and sea. As the planet aged, collisions among these drifting fragments occasionally built something larger. Early in Earth's history, The supercontinent Nuna, also called Columbia, formed when many cratons locked together into a single landmass. Later, another great assembly produced Rodinia, which gathered most of the planet's continents into a new configuration. These supercontinents existed long before Pangaea, showing that Pangaea was not a unique event, but part of a repeating cycle driven by mantle heat and plate motions. Each time a supercontinent assembled, global geography changed in ways that reshaped the oceans. When land clustered into one huge block, broad interior regions became dry, while vast surrounding oceans developed strong, simple circulation patterns around the continental rim. When those supercontinents broke apart, rifts opened, new ocean basins formed, and shallow continental shelves spread along freshly created coastlines. As a result, climate patterns shifted, ocean currents reorganized, and marine life gained new pathways for diversification. Because of this long rhythm of collision and breakup, the oceans did not simply expand or contract at random. They followed cycles that gradually prepared the stage for later worlds. The wide Panthalassic Ocean around Pangaea, and eventually the complex seaways of the late Cretaceous, were descendants of these earlier rearrangements. The same forces that joined Nuna and Rodinia would, much later, carve out the western interior seaway, the Tethys margins, and the broad epicontinental shelves where Cretaceous marine reptiles thrived. What happened as the next great cycle unfolded, and how did these moving plates finally assemble the tranquil, predator-filled seas that existed just before the asteroid arrived? To answer that question, the story pauses and turns in a different direction. Instead of following drifting plates and rising mountains, imagine an Earth where the continents never formed at all. Picture a global ocean stretching unbroken around the planet, with only a thin, dark crust beneath and no land rising above the waves. In this water world, the ocean floor would drop away quickly from mid-ocean ridges into deep basins. There would be almost no broad sunlit shallows. Without continents, there would be no continental shelves, no wide coastal plains, and no epicontinental seas flooding low-lying interiors. The gentle slopes that in later ages supported coral reefs, oyster banks, and seagrass meadows would not exist. Most of the planet's water would be cold and dark, with life forced into narrow bands around hydrothermal vents and the few zones where nutrients managed to rise from the deep. Because of this, the global ocean would be far simpler. There would be fewer places where light, nutrients, and stable seafloors came together. Reef systems would struggle to find footing. Coastal food webs, which depend on rivers delivering minerals and organic matter from land, would never develop. In such an Earth, even if complex organisms evolved, the range of habitats available to them would be sharply limited. What kinds of giants could truly thrive without sheltered bays, tidal flats, and broad inland seas? The real planet followed a different path. Over time, fragments of buoyant crust thickened into continents, and these continents broke, collided, and bent under the slow forces of the mantle. As a result, they carved out long, irregular coastlines and enclosed shallow basins. Continental shelves formed as gentle ramps around the edges of landmasses, turning narrow contact zones between land and sea into vast arenas of life. Rivers carried sediments and nutrients from the interior, feeding plankton blooms that supported dense food webs. This process transformed the margins of the continents into engines of biodiversity, especially in the marine realm. When continents gathered into supercontinents such as Pangaea, the pattern changed again. A single giant landmass meant long continuous coasts in some regions, but also reduced total shoreline compared to many scattered continents. Interior seas closed, while new marginal basins opened along rifted edges. During this time, the arrangement of shallow seas, gulfs, and embayments shifted across the globe. Each reconfiguration redirected ocean currents, altered climate, and reshaped where reefs, fisheries, and future marine reptiles could flourish. To understand the last great Cretaceous seas, it is necessary to trace this longer supercontinent cycle. As Pangaea assembled and later fragmented, it prepared the stage for the western interior seaway that split North America and for the warm Tethys margins that circled the equator. How did those slow continental journeys create the tranquil, predator-filled waters that existed just before the asteroid arrived? And what did daily life look like within those final, peaceful seas? Millions of years before the gentle Cretaceous seas spread across the continents, Earth passed through a very different chapter. All of the major landmasses were moving toward a single destination. The result would be Pangaea, an enormous supercontinent that stretched from near the North Pole to the far south, reshaping the planet's oceans, climate, and future history. Earlier in Earth's history, the continents had been scattered across the surface. Narrow oceans separated drifting blocks of crust, and smaller supercontinents had formed and broken apart. Over time, the same deep forces in the mantle that drove those earlier cycles continued to move the plates. Long chains of subduction zones consumed old ocean floor, pulling continents toward one another and slowly closing wide basins that had existed for hundreds of millions of years. During this time, collisions became unavoidable. As continents converged, their thick, buoyant crust resisted sinking, so the edges crumpled and rose instead. This process built vast mountain belts, such as the Central Pangaean Ranges that once ran through what is now North America, Europe, and Northwest Africa. Ocean basins between the approaching landmasses narrowed. Island arcs were welded onto continental margins, and the last remnants of older oceans disappeared beneath the growing supercontinent. When the collisions finally ended, most of Earth's land had fused into Pangaea. Around it lay a single, enormous global ocean known as Panthalassa, while a smaller equator-hugging seaway called the Tethys Ocean cut into its eastern side. The map of the planet became strikingly simple. One world ocean surrounding one world continent. Coastlines grew very long, but shallow inland seas were relatively rare compared with later times. This new arrangement transformed ocean circulation. With Panthalassa wrapping almost entirely around the globe, currents could travel great distances without being blocked by scattered continents. Because of this connected ocean, heat could be transported efficiently along broad belts of latitude, while the Tethys acted as a warm, tropical corridor. Yet many potential continental shelves remained high and dry, so the broad epicontinental seas of the Cretaceous had not yet formed. Climate on Pangaea reflected this extreme geography. The interior of the supercontinent lay far from the moderating influence of the ocean, leading to hot summers, cold winters, and widespread arid zones. Coastal margins told a different story. Along the edges of Pangaea and within the Tethys realm, moist air, rivers, and shallow marine environments supported lush ecosystems on land and in the sea. How would such contrasting conditions influence the evolution of future oceans? The same tectonic stresses that built Pangaea also weakened it. Thickened crust, trapped mantle heat, and reorganized convection patterns gradually encouraged rifting. Over time, new cracks opened, volcanic activity increased, and the supercontinent began to split apart. As the fragments drifted away, young oceans and wide, shallow seaways flooded low-lying regions, setting the stage for the warm, tranquil Cretaceous seas that would one day host the last great marine reptiles. As Pangaea began to fail, the breakup did not occur in a single tear. It unfolded as a sequence of rifts that carved the supercontinent into separate worlds. What forces could pull apart a landmass that had once stretched nearly from pole to pole? The answer lay deep beneath the crust, where heat and slow motion in the mantle prepared the way. During this time, mantle upwelling gathered below the thickened roots of Pangaea's great mountain belts. Hot material rose, expanded, and weakened the overlying lithosphere. Long zones of tension developed, and the crust started to stretch. As it thinned, fractures opened, volcanic activity increased, and linear rift valleys formed, often filled with lakes and lava. Over time, some of these rifts failed and froze in place, while others continued to widen until new ocean basins were born. The first Great Division separated Pangaea into two broad domains. To the north lay Laurasia, containing the ancestors of North America, Europe, and much of Asia. To the south lay Gondwana, holding future South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. This general statement hides a complex reality. Each of these large blocks soon began its own journey, rotating, colliding, and drifting as new plate boundaries formed around them. Between North America and Africa, one of these successful rifts evolved into the early Atlantic Ocean. Along this young seafloor, a mid-ocean ridge rose where magma from the mantle continually created new crust. On either side, the stretched continental margins subsided, forming broad, shallow shelves. These submerged edges were flooded by warm seas and bathed in sunlight. As a result, they became ideal foundations for carbonate platforms, reef systems, and extensive epicontinental seas. This process of rifting and flooding transformed the planet's surface into a mosaic of basins and seaways. Every new coastline added long stretches of shallow water, only tens of meters deep. Every submerged interior basin created protected embayments and inland seas. Because of this, marine organisms encountered an expanding range of habitats, from clear, reef-rimmed shelves to murkier, nutrient-rich gulfs. Each setting invited life to diversify into new ecological niches. As Gondwana continued to fragment, South America pulled away from Africa. India began to accelerate toward Asia, and Australia and Antarctica started to separate. At the same time, the Tethys Ocean, already a major tropical seaway, widened and wrapped like a blue belt between Laurasia and the southern continents. Its margins hosted long chains of reefs and carbonate platforms that would later shelter many Cretaceous marine communities. High global sea levels during the late Cretaceous amplified the effects of this changing geography. Low-lying interiors of continents were especially vulnerable to flooding. In North America, subsidence and eustatic rise combined to allow a broad arm of the ocean to invade the continent's center, forming the western interior seaway. Similar processes expanded the shallow reaches of the Tethys and other epicontinental seas. These calm, warm waters, born from the breaking of a supercontinent, would soon host the last great sea reptiles and the peaceful marine ecosystems approaching their final hour. Those calm, warm Cretaceous seas did not appear by chance. They were one moment in a far larger rhythm, a slow breathing of the entire planet that has repeated many times through Earth's history. Geologists call this rhythm the supercontinent cycle. Over very long spans of time, the continents on Earth's surface drift together to form a single vast landmass, then gradually split apart again. Earlier in Earth's history, supercontinents such as Columbia and Rodinia formed, broke, and vanished. Much later, Pangaea assembled during the late Paleozoic and then fragmented during the Mesozoic. Each full cycle from assembly to final breakup takes on the order of hundreds of millions of years. This long cycle is driven by forces that begin deep within the mantle. Heat rising from Earth's interior sets up slow convection currents, where hot rock moves upward in cooler, denser rock sinks. At mid-ocean ridges, new crust is created and pushed outward in a process known as ridge push. At subduction zones, old oceanic crust bends and sinks back into the mantle, and its downward pull on the plate is called slab pull. Together, these forces cause the tectonic plates to move, collide, and separate, even when the surface seems unchanging on human timescales. As continents collide, they close oceans and build mountain chains. When they later rift apart, new ocean basins open between them. Because of this, The supercontinent cycle constantly rewrites the map of ocean gateways and seaways. Narrow connections appear and disappear between major basins, altering currents, salinity patterns, and the distribution of heat across the planet. Over time, this process shifts climate belts, redirects storms, and rearranges where shallow continental shelves and deep abyssal plains are found. Marine life responds strongly to these changes. When supercontinents assemble, coastlines shrink and many shallow habitats are lost. When they break apart, long new margins form, epicontinental seas flood low-lying crust, and fresh ecological space opens. As a result, each phase of the cycle tends to be linked with pulses of evolution and extinction in the oceans. Certain groups rise to dominance in one configuration of continents and climate, only to decline as circulation patterns and sea levels change again. How many times has life had to reinvent itself in response to this slow breathing of the planet? The late Cretaceous seas, including the Western Interior Seaway and the Broad Tethys, were direct products of Pangaea's breakup. As North America, Africa, and other fragments drifted apart, spreading ridges and high global sea levels allowed warm waters to spill across continental interiors. During this time, gentle sunlit shelves and deeper offshore basins became extensive, supporting rich plankton blooms, reefs, and the last great marine reptiles. Yet this configuration is temporary. The plates continue to move, and future supercontinents will erase these basins as completely as earlier ones were erased. The peaceful Cretaceous oceans are only a single inhalation in Earth's long-breathing cycle. The next step in this story arrives not from the mantle but from space, and it is already on its way. The peaceful Cretaceous oceans are only a single inhalation in Earth's long-breathing cycle. To sense that cycle, the view must change. Instead of floating beside a single mosasaur, imagine the entire planet pulled into frame and time itself accelerated until 1 billion years pass in a few heartbeats. In this vision, continents glide across the curved surface like slow rafts on a dark sea. They drift together, collide and thicken into high mountain chains. They stretch, crack, and pull apart again. Oceans open as new crust is formed along mid-ocean ridges, while other basins narrow and vanish where slabs of seafloor sink back into the mantle. Over time, this process repeats many times, and earlier arrangements are overwritten like fading images on the same canvas. Coastlines flicker in and out of existence so quickly that they resemble pulses of light. Shallow epicontinental seas surge inland across low-lying regions, then drain away as sea level falls or land rises. Island arcs sweep along subduction zones, merge with the larger landmasses, and are ground down by erosion. Because of this constant motion, no single shoreline remains fixed for long on geological scales. At the same time, long belts of mountains rise where continents collide, then slowly sag and crumble under their own weight. Rivers carve valleys, glaciers advance and retreat, and sediment spreads outward to build new plains. From this height and speed, ice ages, greenhouse intervals, and shifting climate zones appear as gentle color changes sliding across the planet's skin. Life is present throughout this accelerated history, but it registers more as a persistent glow than as individual creatures. Early microbial mats spread along coasts. Later forests darken the interiors of continents, and reefs trace bright rims along warm shelves. Extinctions flash as brief dimmings, followed by renewed bursts of growth as surviving lineages adapt and radiate into newly opened spaces. Against this billion-year backdrop, the late Cretaceous seas appear as a brief, bright flare. The Western Interior Seaway, the Tethys, and other shallow basins bloom suddenly across the continents, outlined by dense belts of reefs and plankton-rich waters. For a moment in this long sequence, marine reptiles, ammonites, and large bony fish dominate the blue portions of the planet. Then their signal is poised to vanish almost at once, within the smooth rhythm of spreading ridges, subduction zones, and supercontinent cycles. the asteroid impact stands out as a sharp spike. Geological change usually advances like a slow tide, but here the time-lapse shows a single violent interruption. A pinpoint flash, a spreading ring of disturbance, and a rapid darkening of many coastal and shallow seas. As a result, the contrast between ordinary tectonic change and sudden catastrophe becomes unmistakable. Now the pace can slow again. The view narrows from the entire planet back to one ocean, one inland seaway, one reef. Having seen the grand choreography of moving continents and rising and falling seas, the focus can return to a single act, the final chapter of the Cretaceous oceans, just before that spike arrives. The view now shifts again, away from a single reef and back across deep time. Long before the final Cretaceous seas, another great transition had reshaped the oceans. After the end Permian crisis, during the early Mesozoic, Earth's waters slowly filled with new kinds of swimmers. The Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous together formed a long interval often called the Age of Reptiles, not only on land, but across the oceans as well. During this time, the global map of life changed. Lineages that had survived the Permian extinction began to radiate into empty ecological space. Among them were reptiles that had once walked on land. Over time, some of these animals returned to the sea, their limbs flattening into paddles, their bodies streamlining, their lungs adapted for long dives. This process turned shore-dwelling hunters into fully marine reptiles that would dominate open waters. The earliest of these new ocean reptiles included the ichthyosaurs. These animals evolved into fish-shaped forms with large eyes and powerful tails, cruising through the Triassic seas like reptilian tunas. Alongside them, another experiment in marine life appeared, the plesiosaurs. Their broad bodies, four strong flippers, and often elongated necks created a very different silhouette, more like a living submarine moving with steady underwater flight. Both groups showed how many times reptiles invaded the ocean, testing different solutions to swimming, breathing, and hunting. While reptiles transformed, another group quietly became central to marine food webs. Ammonites, coiled-shelled relatives of modern squids and octopuses, spread through the Mesozoic oceans. Their shells, tightly wound into spirals, were divided by intricate internal walls. The junctions of these walls, called sutures, became increasingly complex, forming delicate, leaf-like patterns pressed into stone. Because of this, ammonite fossils now serve as precise time markers in the rock record. Their shell shapes also diversified, from tightly coiled discs to more open spirals and even strange uncoiled forms. These ammonites were not just passive drifters. Many were active swimmers, and important prey for larger reptiles and fish. Their numbers rose and fell with each environmental disturbance. During this time, the oceans did not remain stable. Through the Triassic and Jurassic, marine ecosystems faced repeated crises, including smaller extinction pulses and shifts in sea level and climate. Each disturbance removed some lineages and favored others. As a result, certain body plans and lifestyles proved more resilient. Streamlined, fast-swimming predators persisted. Flexible, generalist feeders often survived where specialists vanished. Ammonites repeatedly rebounded, evolving new forms after each setback. Marine reptiles diversified, then contracted, then diversified again as continents continued to drift and new seaways opened across the planet's surface. By the later Cretaceous, the cast of characters had changed once more. Ichthyosaurs, so successful in earlier periods, had disappeared. Plesiosaurs had split into long-necked fish hunters and shorter-necked, faster pursuit forms. Most dramatically, lizard relatives had fully taken to the water, giving rise to mosasaurs, which would become the dominant large predators of the final Cretaceous seas. What did such a world look and feel like when these lineages reached their peak just before the asteroid arrived? The next part of the story returns to those warm epicontinental seas, where these last great marine reptiles moved through calm, plankton-rich waters, unaware of the approaching end. To understand those calm, plankton-rich waters, it is necessary to step back and look at the entire planet near the end of the Cretaceous. During this time, Earth was in a pronounced greenhouse state. Concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were far higher than today. Little or no permanent ice existed at the poles. As a result, temperatures were warm from the equator to high latitudes, and even polar seas remained largely ice-free through the year. This greenhouse climate was driven by long-term geological processes. Intense volcanic activity along spreading ridges and large igneous provinces released heat and greenhouse gases from the mantle into the atmosphere. Warm air held more moisture, which trapped additional heat and reinforced the mild conditions. Over time, this process produced a world with gentle temperature gradients, where tropical conditions extended far toward the poles, and seasonal extremes were muted compared with much of later Earth history. High global temperatures also affected the shape of the oceans themselves. When the oceanic crust near mid-ocean ridges was very young and hot, it swelled and stood higher than older, cooler seafloor. Because of this, the average level of the global seafloor rose. Water that would normally occupy deep ocean basins was displaced outward onto the edges of the continents. Sea level climbed to some of the highest positions in Phanerozoic history, flooding vast, low-lying regions of the continental margins. These flooded regions formed broad, shallow, epicontinental seas that pushed far into the interiors of continents. One of the most striking examples was the Western Interior Seaway, which split North America into two landmasses and stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. Similar shallow arms of the Tethys Ocean extended across parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. In many places, the water was only tens of meters deep, yet it covered areas that today lie hundreds of kilometers from any coast. Shallow depth, warm temperatures, and wide continental shelves created ideal conditions for marine life. Sunlight penetrated much of the water column, allowing photosynthetic plankton to thrive. Rivers and coastal erosion delivered nutrients from the continents into these interior basins. Circulation patterns mixed these nutrients through the upper layers, maintaining high productivity. In turn, vast populations of plankton supported dense communities of invertebrates, fish, and large marine reptiles that hunted or filtered the rich water column. In such seas, ammonites spiraled through midwaters, schools of bony fish flashed over soft seafloor, and large air-breathing reptiles cruised between shorelines that lay far inland compared with modern coasts. Mosasaurs, long-necked elasmosaurs, and other marine specialists found steady food supplies along gentle slopes, over submerged sandbars, and above deeper channels. The environment was not free of predators, yet the overall setting favored stable, long-lived ecosystems rather than constant crisis. How would daily life have appeared within these broad, warm basins? This was the stage on which the last great sea monsters lived out their final chapters. A greenhouse world, high seas, and extensive epicontinental waters combined to form some of the most hospitable marine habitats in Earth's history. Because of this unusual arrangement of climate and oceans, the closing Cretaceous seas became both a refuge and a showcase for marine diversity. The next part of the story moves inside one of these inland oceans, following its inhabitants through an ordinary day that unfolds under an extraordinary, if temporary, stability. In the closing stage of the Cretaceous, that apparent stability had a physical heart, a great inland sea that cut a continent in two. During this time, global sea levels were so high that a broad, shallow arm of the ocean flooded the center of North America. This Western Interior Seaway stretched from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, and at its widest, spanned nearly 1,000 kilometers from shore to shore, turning the interior of the continent into a vast marine corridor. From above, the planet's western landmass and its eastern counterpart appeared as separate, irregular islands of crust flanking a gleaming interior sea. The Rocky Mountain region marked a low western shoreline, while the rising highlands of the ancient Appalachians framed the east. Between them lay a gently sloping seafloor, rarely more than a few hundred meters deep, bathed in warm, sunlit water. This arrangement allowed ocean water to move far into the continental interior, carrying heat and nutrients across what had once been dry land. The character of this sea differed from the deep open oceans that bordered the continents. Because of this relatively shallow depth, sunlight penetrated far down the water column, supporting dense blooms of plankton near the surface. When these microscopic organisms died, their remains drifted slowly downward, settling as soft, fine sediment. Over time, this process built thick layers of mud and chalk, rich in calcium carbonate, that blanketed the seafloor. In some regions, the sediment was so dominated by plankton shells that it hardened into nearly pure chalk. These quiet deposits later formed some of the most informative rock units in Earth's history. The Niobrara Formation, with its light-colored chalks, and the darker shales of the Pierre Formation together, record entire food webs from this inland sea. Within these layers lie delicate fossils of foraminifera and coccolithophores, schooling fish, coiled ammonites, large marine turtles, and the bones of giant mosasaurs that patrolled the midwaters as apex predators. As a result, the Western Interior Seaway provides a detailed cross-section of late Cretaceous marine life, from microscopic producers to the largest hunters. At the time, the surface of this sea would have appeared deceptively gentle. Low waves rolled across a wide horizon, broken only by distant lines of shore, and occasional chalky cliffs where the sediments had been uplifted along the margins. The air was warm and often humid, carrying the salt smell of open water far inland. Beneath the quiet surface, however, the water column was busy. Plankton drifting in sunlit layers, fish and ammonites weaving through dimmer depths, and large reptiles rising at intervals to breathe. What would a visitor have noticed here, 100,000 years before the impact that ended the Cretaceous? The scene would have seemed stable, even timeless, with no obvious sign that this inland sea was temporary. The Western Interior Seaway functioned as a thriving, interconnected habitat, linking distant regions and supporting dense populations of marine organisms. Yet subtle changes were already underway in the climate and in the land around its shores, setting the stage for a transformation that would reach even these calm interior waters. From a distance, the Western Interior Seaway might not look like a geologic problem at all. It would appear instead as a destination. Imagine opening a prehistoric travel brochure and finding, across the center of North America, a long, shallow arm of ocean described as warm, quiet, and filled with life. During this time, global sea levels were so high that this inland sea stretched for thousands of kilometers, with horizons that seemed to run unbroken from subtropical shorelines to a hazy blue distance. In some regions, the scene would resemble parts of the modern Gulf of Mexico, with broad, shallow shelves and gently sloping seafloors. In others, it would recall the calmest margins of the Caribbean, where clear water, bright sun, and low waves create a sense of stable, predictable conditions. Along the coasts, the land would not rise sharply from the water. Instead, low sandy shorelines would extend inland, broken by quiet bays and occasional river deltas. Dinosaur tracks would press into wet sediment, forming paths that led from fern-covered floodplains down to the water's edge. Gentle waves would move across these beaches, smoothing the edges of footprints, while small crustaceans and burrowing animals disturbed the upper layers of the sediment. Over time, this process would preserve a record of each visit in thin, alternating bands of sand and mud. Above the shoreline, pterosaurs would glide and circle, following the lines of the coast and the mouths of rivers where fish gathered in dense schools. Their shadows would move across the surface as they searched for movement just below the waves. Farther out, the sea would deepen but remain relatively clear, with suspended plankton giving the water a soft green-blue color. Beneath that surface, the attractions would be even more striking. In some areas, low mounds of shell-rich bioherms and patch reefs would rise from the seafloor, formed by accumulations of oysters, rudist-like bivalves, and other encrusting organisms. Small fish would weave among these structures. Gentle filter-feeding sharks would pass through, straining plankton rather than hunting large prey. In the middle distance, the shapes of larger marine reptiles would appear and disappear, their bodies cutting long, slow paths through the water column as they moved between feeding grounds. Seen as a destination, the Western Interior Seaway becomes easier to picture. It functioned like a vast inland version of familiar modern coasts, combining features of shallow tropical shelves, quiet bays, and productive estuaries. As a result, it supported dense populations of organisms that filled nearly every available niche. Yet this apparent vacation landscape exists only in fragments. The beaches are now beds of sandstone. The deltas are layered in mudstone and shale, and the clear water is recorded in chalk and limestone. Because of this, the guidebook for this ancient coast must be reconstructed from fossils, sedimentary structures, and chemical signals locked into the crust. The next step is to look more closely at the inhabitants themselves and at how their peaceful routines unfolded in these final Cretaceous seas. Millions of years ago, Earth had a very different arrangement of land and oceans. The Western Interior Seaway was only one branch of a much larger marine network that wrapped around the planet. To understand the last great sea monsters, the view must widen beyond a single inland sea and follow the water into the global circulation of the late Cretaceous. At the center of this marine world lay the Tethys Ocean, a broad, warm seaway stretching between the northern continents and the southern landmasses of Gondwanan origin. Its surface waters were tropical to subtropical, bathed in intense sunlight and stirred by steady winds. Along its margins, carbonate platforms and reefs formed where the crust subsided slowly, and clear water allowed organisms to build thick piles of limestone. During this time, currents flowing through Tethys helped transfer heat from the equator toward higher latitudes, shaping climate patterns across the planet. Around this central ocean, epicontinental seas spread over low-lying continental interiors. Across what is now Europe, shallow chalk seas covered wide regions from England to Poland and beyond. Fine planktonic shells rained down through the water column and accumulated into the soft, white sediment that would later harden into chalk cliffs. Similar shallow basins existed along the margins of Africa and South America, where broad continental shelves were flooded by high global sea levels. Because of this, many continents carried extensive, sunlit seaways that supported rich marine communities far inland from the open ocean. These flooded regions did not form one uniform habitat. Instead, they created a connected but varied mosaic of environments, linked by currents yet distinct in temperature, depth, and nutrient supply. This process of repeated flooding and retreat carved out embayments, straits, and broad shelves where different communities evolved. Some areas favored large mosasaurs and plesiosaurs hunting fish and ammonites. Others supported dense schools of bony fish, filter-feeding sharks, and delicate invertebrates that lived on or just above the seafloor. Over time, this patchwork of seas allowed lineages of marine reptiles, fish, and invertebrates to diversify in separate basins while still exchanging migrants along coastal corridors. One of the most significant windows into this world is found in northwestern Europe, in the Maastricht Formation of the Netherlands and surrounding regions. There, late Maastrichtian chalks and sands preserve the remains of large marine reptiles, including the iconic genus Mosasaurus. Fossils from these deposits were so important to early paleontology that the final age of the Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian, was named after this area. The rocks record a shallow shelf sea connected to the wider Tethyan realm, showing that even near the end of the Cretaceous, these waters still supported thriving, complex ecosystems. As a result, the final chapter of the Cretaceous seas cannot be told from the western interior seaway alone. The last sea monsters lived in a truly global network of basins and coastlines, from the warm Tethys to the chalk seas of Europe and the flooded shelves of Africa and South America. The western interior will remain a central stage in this story, but each region contributed its own cast of animals and its own version of a peaceful, productive sea. The next step is to move from this global map back into specific communities and examine how life functioned within these interconnected habitats in the final moments before the asteroid impact. From that global map of inland seaways and broad continental shelves, it becomes possible to zoom down into the living structure of these oceans. Each region held its own cast of organisms, yet all were linked by a similar pattern, a food web rising from light and microscopic life toward the great reptiles near the surface. To understand the peaceful tales of these seas, the story must begin with the smallest producers. Near the sunlit surface, vast fields of phytoplankton drifted with the currents. These single-celled organisms, along with photosynthetic bacteria, used sunlight, dissolved nutrients and carbon dioxide to build organic matter. During this time, their constant activity turned the upper water into a biological engine. This process fixed energy into tiny cells that could be eaten, recycled, and passed upward through the web. Because of this, even a seemingly empty stretch of Cretaceous water was quietly productive. Feeding on this microscopic rain were zooplankton, small crustaceans, larval invertebrates, and countless drifting animals. Over time, they formed dense layers in the water column, rising toward the surface at night and sinking by day. Small fish schools moved among them, snapping up clusters of prey. Ammonites with coiled shells and tentacled heads patrolled the mid-depths, while shrimp-like crustaceans filtered and scavenged. Together, these organisms created a thick, living middle to the sea, where energy from the surface was gathered and concentrated. Into this crowded midzone came larger consumers. Medium-sized bony fish, some armored with heavy scales, cruised in loose groups. Marine turtles moved between coastal shallows and open channels, grazing, browsing, and occasionally hunting soft-bodied prey. Among the most distinctive were filter-feeding sharks, such as Tychodus. Their broad, pavement-like teeth were adapted not for tearing, but for crushing shelly animals and sieving rich patches of plankton. Instead of sudden attacks, much of their day involved steady swimming through plankton-rich waters, mouths open, processing whatever the currents delivered. Above and among these calmer feeders, apex predators completed the structure. Mosasaurs such as Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus, with flexible skulls and powerful tails, hunted fish, ammonites, and other reptiles. Long-necked elasmosaurid plesiosaurs picked off smaller fish and cephalopods with quick strikes, while more robust plesiosaurs targeted larger prey. Did these hunters clash with one another? Occasionally, yes, and bite marks on fossil bones record such encounters. Yet most of the time, their lives were dominated by routine patrols, ambushes on schooling fish, and long migrations between productive regions. As a result, the late Cretaceous seas were not continuous battlefields, but layered communities built on repeated, predictable exchanges of energy. Phytoplankton captured sunlight, zooplankton and small invertebrates gathered that energy, medium consumers redistributed it, and the great reptiles harvested the surplus. Day after day, this structure supported growth, reproduction, and seasonal movement, rather than constant crisis. The approaching asteroid would eventually disrupt every level of this web. But before that sudden break, the next part of the story follows individual habitats to see how this quiet abundance played out in specific places. In these quiet, productive seas, one group of reptiles stood above all others. Before the asteroid arrived, the last great sea monsters were not dinosaurs, but air-breathing lizards that had fully returned to the water. These were the mosasaurs, dominant hunters of the late Cretaceous oceans and inland seaways. Mosasaurs were true marine lizards. Their distant ancestors had walked on land, but over time their bodies changed until they were entirely committed to life in the water. The limbs that once supported them on the surface of the continents had transformed into strong flippers. Their long, flexible bodies ended in powerful, laterally flattened tails that generated thrust with sweeping strokes. Some species, such as the largest mosasaurus, exceeded 15 meters in length and occupied the same role in their ecosystems that large sharks and orcas fill today. The heads of these reptiles reveal how they fed. Their skulls were built with loose, flexible joints, and their lower jaws were double-hinged. This arrangement allowed each side of the jaw to move slightly on its own, opening the mouth wide and then drawing prey inward. The teeth were sharply pointed and curved backward. As a result, once a fish, turtle, or squid passed the front of the jaws, it was very difficult for it to escape. This process did not involve chewing. Instead, the prey was seized, repositioned, and then swallowed nearly whole. Fossils provide direct evidence of these habits. In some skeletons, the ribcage still contains the remains of the last meal. Stomach contents show that different mosasaur species consumed fish, ammonites with coiled shells, marine turtles, diving birds, and even smaller mosasaurs. Because of this, paleontologists view them as flexible apex predators that could exploit many parts of the food web during this time. Bite marks on bones, matching the spacing of mosasaur teeth, confirm that they sometimes scavenged as well as hunted. Despite their fearsome jaws, these animals did not spend every moment in violent pursuit. Much of their existence was spent cruising through warm water, moving with steady strokes of the tail, and using their forked tongues and sensitive snouts to sample chemical traces in the sea. They rose regularly to the surface to breathe, exhaling and inhaling in brief intervals before sinking back into the dimmer layers below. Many researchers infer that they patrolled loose territories, returning to favored hunting grounds, shallow coastal shelves, and migration corridors that crossed the western interior seaway. The most famous remains of these reptiles come from the Maastricht Formation in what is now the Netherlands. Here, chalky marine sediments near the top of the rock record contain abundant bones and skulls of Mosasaurus. This layer was formed in the final part of the Cretaceous, only a short geological distance below the KPG boundary clay that marks the impact. Standing at the base of those cliffs, a person moves upward from older beds rich in mosasaurs into younger beds where they vanish. What did the last of these air-breathing dragons experience in the final days before that boundary was laid down? To approach an answer, it helps to leave the cliffs and enter the water itself. Imagine one of those final mosasaurs not as a fossil in a rock face, but as a living animal beginning an ordinary day in the late Cretaceous sea. Dawn comes softly to the western interior seaway. In the dim green light, an adult mosasaur rises from depth, its long body moving with slow, economical strokes. It breaks the surface, jaws parting slightly as it draws in air. For a moment, it hangs there, eyes just above the waterline, scanning the shimmering surface where weak sunlight meets a sky still fading from night. Then, breath taken, it tilts downward and slides back into the cooler, dimmer water below. During this time, the water column is layered. A warm surface band lies over a cooler interior, and the mosasaur settles along the boundary where temperatures shift. This invisible thermocline acts like a highway. Here it can cruise with minimal effort, its tail sweeping side to side as it follows gentle gradients of temperature and scent. Faint chemical traces drift past, the iron tang of distant blood, the musk of other reptiles, the background taste of plankton and decay that fills this inland sea. The animal turns toward a slightly stronger trail. Ahead, a loose school of fish pulses in the half-light, each individual flashing briefly as it turns. The mosasaur does not rush. It closes the distance with steady movements, then, in a brief pattern of violence, accelerates. Muscles contract, the tail lashes, and the broad head snaps sideways through the school. One fish disappears in a sudden clamp of teeth. The disturbance ends almost as quickly as it began, and the predator returns to its measured pace, swallowing and beginning the slow process of digestion. Over time, the day settles into long stretches of quiet. The mosasaur rests in mid-water, lungs full, body nearly motionless. Small adjustments of its flippers keep it neutrally balanced. Around it, schools of smaller fish flow like living currents, while in the hazy distance, a plesiosaur with an extremely long neck rises and falls, searching for its own prey. There is no chase, no clash, only shared space in a broad, three-dimensional environment. Later, the scent of damaged shell drifts upward from the seafloor. Investigating, the mosasaur finds an injured ammonite slowly spiraling, its once buoyant chamber cracked. A quick bite crushes the remaining structure. As a result, rich, soft tissues are exposed, and the predator feeds methodically before returning to the thermocline, heavy now with food. As daylight fades, the surface darkens to a mirror of deepening blue, and then to black. The mosasaur rises again, breaking through a skin of water that now reflects distant stars. It breathes under the same constellations that shine on the planet today, unaware that far beyond its horizon, an asteroid has already been set on a path that will end this calm routine and reshape life in Earth's oceans. Far below those reflected stars, another kind of marine reptile moves with less drama but equal mastery of the water. Long-necked elasmosaurid plesiosaurs glide through the late Cretaceous seas, their bodies shaped into a living compromise between stability and reach. A small, narrow head sits at the end of a neck that can be more than half the total body length, while four strong flippers drive the animal forward like underwater wings. In outline, an elasmosaurid looks almost improbable. The torso is compact and barrel-shaped, the tail short, the neck a chain of dozens of vertebrae that curves gently through the water column. This arrangement formed a flexible but controlled structure, capable of sweeping arcs and subtle bends rather than quick whipping motions. The flippers beat in a steady, almost aircraft-like pattern, generating lift and thrust as the animal flies through the sea instead of simply pushing against it. During this time, these plesiosaurs occupy the role of mid-level predator in many warm epicontinental seas, including the western interior seaway. Their prey is not the giant turtles or other large reptiles that share these waters, but schools of small fish and soft-bodied cephalopods that drift and pulse through the mid-depths. The long neck allows the body to remain relatively still, while the head alone reaches into dense clusters of prey. As a result, the main bulk of the animal does not break the school or send alarm ripples outward. This hunting strategy depends on minimizing disturbance. Hydrodynamic studies of their body shape and neck proportions suggest that rapid twisting or sudden acceleration would create large pressure waves in the water. Instead, the elasmosaurid advances slowly, then curves its neck forward or sideways, inserting the small head into the edge of a school and snapping up fish before they fully register the threat. Because of this, the kill itself is brief and localized, while the surrounding sea remains largely undisturbed. Bone structure adds another line of evidence. The limb girdles and flippers are built for continuous, moderate power rather than explosive sprinting. The vertebrae of the neck interlock to limit extreme flexion, but support smooth, controlled motion. This process of anatomical specialization points to an animal adapted for endurance swimming, able to cross broad, shallow seaways without fatigue, but not designed for high-speed chases. Other plesiosaurs in these oceans follow a different pattern. Shorter-necked polycotylids have larger heads, more streamlined bodies, and relatively stiffer trunks. They may have been more agile pursuit predators, accelerating toward individual targets rather than infiltrating schools. In some regions, the two groups share the same broad habitat, but partition it by prey size and hunting style, reducing direct competition. Over time, the daily life of an elasmosaurid is defined more by steady motion than by sudden violence. Long periods are spent cruising just below the surface or in calm mid-waters, flippers beating in quiet rhythm as the animal scans for the silvery shimmer of fish. The surrounding environment is rich but not chaotic, filled with plankton, small invertebrates, and the distant silhouettes of larger reptiles. In this layered water column, the elasmosaurid's restrained movements and patient foraging contribute to the overall sense of a stable, peaceful sea. Yet even this low-drama routine exists within a wider network of interactions. Their presence shapes the behavior of fish schools, influences where cephalopods gather, and feeds larger scavengers when an individual dies and drifts to the seafloor. How will these calm, enduring swimmers respond when the stability of their world is suddenly broken? When that stability does break, it is not always because of teeth and speed. Sometimes the shift comes from sheer size moving quietly through the water. In these late Cretaceous seas, many of the largest shapes are not hunters at all, but calm grazers and filter feeders that turn sunlight and plankton into living mass. Among them are giant marine turtles. Some carry broad, gently domed shells that cast wide shadows on the seafloor, while powerful flippers push them with slow, deliberate strokes. They drift above patches of algae and soft seafloor plants, cropping the growth that thrives in the warm, shallow margins of the western interior seaway and the Tethyan coasts. Others move closer to the surface, rising through shafts of light to bite at jellyfish-like prey and delicate drifting invertebrates. Their movements are steady rather than sudden, more about endurance than acceleration. These turtles occupy many of the same roles that later sea turtles will fill on this planet. During this time, they recycle nutrients by grazing, disturb the sediment as they land to rest, and provide moving islands of hard shell that smaller animals occasionally follow. Over time, their steady feeding helps shape which plant communities dominate certain bays and shelves, even though no single bite seems important. Sharing these waters are filter-feeding sharks that challenge the usual image of sharp-toothed predators. Genera such as Tychodus carry broad, pavement-like crushing teeth along their jaws. Instead of slicing flesh, these teeth grind shellfish, soft-bodied invertebrates, and dense clusters of planktonic organisms. In life, they likely cruised with mouths partly open, sieving rich water masses in a way more comparable to modern whale sharks than to movie monsters. What does it mean when a shark's primary tool is not a weapon, but a mill? Large bony fish add another layer to this gentle giant community. Sleek, fast swimming forms fill roles similar to modern tunas, moving in coordinated schools through the midwater, while deeper-bodied species resemble groupers that patrol reefs and carbonate platforms. Some grow to lengths that in later oceans would be associated with small whales. Many feed by straining plankton, small crustaceans, and tiny fish from dense swarms, their wide mouths operating as filters rather than spears. Together, these animals occupy the mid to upper levels of the food web. Without acting as classic apex predators, they intercept the energy that begins in microscopic plankton and benthic invertebrates and turn it into slow, steady biomass. This process smooths the flow of energy through the ecosystem, supporting scavengers, large reptiles, and even the microbial communities that will later recycle their remains into the sedimentary record of Earth's crust. Because of this, much of the Cretaceous ocean is defined by calm cruising, grazing, and filtering. Bursts of predation arrive like punctuation marks rather than continuous chaos. Yet in a world where so much energy is stored in large, peaceful bodies, how long can such tranquility last when environmental pressures begin to rise again? In the quiet intervals between those bursts of predation, the middle layers of the Cretaceous seas remained constantly in motion, Here, far from the safety of the seafloor and the brightness of the surface, the water column was crowded with drifting bodies, pulsing fins, and coiled shells. This was the realm of the ammonites, and they filled it in staggering numbers. Ammonites were coiled shell cephalopods, distant relatives of modern squids and octopuses. Their bodies occupied the outermost chamber of a spiral shell, with soft tentacles, eyes, and a beak-like mouth protruding from the opening. Muscular movements within the shell's internal chambers allowed them to adjust buoyancy, so they could rise and sink through the water column with relative ease. During this time, countless individuals hovered at different depths, forming a living bridge between the plankton above and the larger hunters that patrolled these seas. Their shells carried one of the most intricate signatures in the fossil record: complex fractal-like suture patterns where the internal walls met the outer shell. In cross-section, these sutures appear as lacework lines, branching and folding again and again. This process of elaborating the junctions increased the strength of the shell, helping it resist both water pressure and crushing bites. As a result, some ammonites thrived in shallow, wave-agitated waters, while others occupied deeper, darker zones where pressure was far greater. Ecologically, ammonites did not all live in the same way. Some species were active swimmers near the surface, with streamlined shells that reduced drag as they chased small fish or crustaceans in sunlit waters. Others had more inflated, less hydrodynamic shells, suggesting a drifting lifestyle, slowly moving with currents and feeding on plankton or tiny animals that wandered too close to their tentacles. Over time, this diversity in form and behavior allowed them to fill many of the midwater niches available in the late Cretaceous oceans. Because of this, ammonites became a crucial link in marine food webs. They concentrated the energy of microscopic plankton into bodies large enough for bigger predators to target. Mosasaurs, with their flexible skulls and powerful tails, lunged upward through schools of ammonites. Long-necked plesiosaurs snatched individuals with rapid strikes of their heads. Large bony fish bit through shells, leaving broken coils that spiraled down to the seafloor. Every successful hunt turned the quiet drifting of ammonites into sudden violence, then back to stillness as the water closed again. Even in the final few million years before the KPG boundary, ammonites remained incredibly diverse. In many regions, their shells continued to accumulate in sediments without any clear sign that their long history was about to end. To an observer in those last Cretaceous seas, the water column would have seemed stable, familiar, and endlessly replenished. Yet somewhere beyond the atmosphere, a different process had already begun. What happens when a world that appears so full and secure meets a change that arrives from far beyond Earth itself? To answer that question, the view shifts from the broad map of continents and seas to a single descent into the water. Imagine a warm late Cretaceous night above the western interior seaway. The shoreline is quiet, the air heavy with moisture, and the moon hangs low over a planet that appears settled and mature. From the surface, the sea looks like a continuous sheet of dark glass, broken only by slow, regular swells. Then the surface is left behind. The first meters below are almost black, yet not entirely. Tiny sparks drift in the water, marking the presence of bioluminescent plankton. With each movement, clouds of light swirl and fold back, tracing the shape of an arm, a hand, or a fin passing through. Over time, these microscopic organisms have adapted to the gentle turbulence of this shallow epicontinental sea, turning even the smallest disturbance into a soft electric glow. The soundscape is muted. High, sharp clicks from crustaceans carry through the water, bouncing off shells and carbonate sand. Farther out, a deeper rhythmic pulse becomes clear, the slow, deliberate sweep of a plesiosaur's flippers. Each stroke pushes water with a low, steady whoosh, like distant oars in a hidden boat. Much lower still, almost at the edge of perception, comes a brief rising rush, the pressure wave of a mosasaur slipping through the darkness far below, then fading again into silence. Vision adjusts as the descent continues. Ammonites drift in the mid-water, their coiled shells faintly outlined by scattered moonlight filtering down from the surface. Tentacles pulse and spread, catching small fish and plankton, then fold inward in a practiced, unhurried rhythm. Nearby, a school of fish turns as one body, each flank catching a thin line of light before vanishing back into shadow. A giant marine turtle passes across the field of view, its shell broad and scarred, its flippers moving in slow, even strokes. It resembles a silent, living submarine, crossing a column of water that has supported such journeys for millions of years. During this time, there is no frantic chase, no sudden eruption of violence. Predators patrol, but their paths are measured and efficient. Smaller animals forage across the dim seafloor, sifting sediment, browsing algae, or resting in shallow burrows. This process of feeding, migrating, and pausing continues through the night, guided by ancient cycles of tide and light. Because of this regularity, the entire scene feels calm, almost meditative, as if the sea itself is breathing slowly. From below, the surface is now a pale, rippling ceiling. It seems unchanged from countless earlier nights in Earth's history. Yet beyond that thin boundary, past the atmosphere and out into space, another body is also moving along its own path. As a result, this peaceful water column exists in the final moments before an object already on course will intersect the planet and transform these quiet seas forever. In the hours before impact, the quiet water column above gives way, near the coasts, to something very different. Along the margins of the continents and around the edges of the great seaways, the Cretaceous ocean becomes bright, crowded, and surprisingly sheltered. Here, in water that might only reach a few tens of meters deep, sunlight pours down to the seafloor and turns the entire zone into a broad, living terrace around the planet. Across these shelves, the surface is rippled by waves, but below lies a mosaic of sandy bottoms, patchy reefs, and low meadows of seagrass-like plants. These flowering relatives of early land vegetation have invaded the shallows and formed dense beds, stabilizing the sediment and trapping fine particles. Between them, clear channels cut through pale sand, while darker ridges mark places where reef-building organisms have taken hold. Over time, this patchwork has grown into a complex, three-dimensional landscape. Many of the reef-like structures are not built by corals in the modern sense, but by strange bivalves called rudists. These shellfish rise as towers, cups, and clustered chimneys, cemented together with sponges, algae, and encrusting organisms. This process produces ridges, knobs, and overhangs that break the current and create shadows, crevices, and small caves. As a result, the seafloor here resembles a Cretaceous equivalent of a coral reef, with countless microhabitats compressed into a relatively small area. Because of this structural complexity, the shallow margins function as immense nurseries. Clouds of juvenile fish shelter among the rudist pillars and seagrass blades, their small bodies nearly invisible against the dappled light. Young turtles rest on the sand between feeding bouts, rising occasionally to the surface for air. It is likely that smaller young marine reptiles, including early stages of mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, also hunt and hide here, protected from the largest open water predators that prefer deeper channels and offshore slopes. The daily rhythms of these environments are steady, but never still. Tides advance and retreat, alternately uncovering and submerging sandbanks, exposing mudflats to the air before drawing warm, nutrient-rich water back across them. Schools of small fish move like shifting silver bands between seagrass and reef, pursued by sleeker hunters that dart in and out of view. Above them, gentle filter feeders, from ray-like fishes to small plankton-feeding sharks, cruise just off the bottom, sieving the water column for suspended life. During this time, every tidal cycle stirs sediment, releases nutrients, and feeds plankton. In turn, plankton feeds invertebrates, which feed fishes, which support turtles, birds, and marine reptiles. The shallow shelves act as engines that convert sunlight into biomass and then export it. Currents carry drifting larvae, dead organic matter, and migrating schools out toward the deeper basins, linking quiet lagoons to the wider seaway. How far does the influence of these margins extend into the offshore realms where the largest predators roam? These calm, productive shallows are therefore not isolated oases, but crucial nodes in the late Cretaceous food web. They maintain high primary productivity, seed surrounding waters with new generations of organisms, and buffer many species from the full hazards of the open ocean. Yet they, too, lie under the same sky and orbit the same star. As the planet continues its path, these nursery grounds are unknowingly preparing the last great cohorts of life that will face the sudden changes to come. Beyond those sheltered nursery grounds, the western interior seaway opened into a vast middle realm of water, stretching from sunlit surface to shadowed depths. Here, far from shore and far above the seafloor, life occupied an immense three-dimensional space that seemed almost empty at first glance. Yet this apparent emptiness was quietly structured by light, temperature, and drifting life. In the upper tens of meters, daylight still reached down, but it was softer and more diffuse than in the shallows. The water was cooler, layered into gentle thermal bands that shifted with seasons and currents. Tiny planktonic organisms, from photosynthetic algae to minute drifting animals, formed a suspended haze, their remains mixed with volcanic ash, fine clay, and organic fragments, creating a slow rain of particles that sank through the column. Over time, this process built the fine-grained sediments that later hardened into formations such as the Niobrara and Pierre Shale. Invisible currents moved through this space, turning the midwaters into broad flowing highways. These currents transported pulses of plankton, concentrating food into long, irregular ribbons that could stretch for many kilometers. Because of this, fish schools, ammonite swarms, and larger reptiles often aligned their movements with the flow, following rich patches as they drifted. During this time, the pathways of water did as much to organize life as the outlines of continents or coasts. Midwater dwellers showed behaviors adapted to both safety and efficiency. Many fish formed tight schools, their bodies reflecting the dim light as a single coordinated shape. Some groups of smaller animals migrated vertically each day, rising toward the surface at night to feed in darkness and sinking back into deeper, safer layers at dawn. Larger predators, including mosasaurs and long-necked plesiosaurs, cruised with slow, energy-saving strokes, their bodies shaped to glide rather than sprint. They often patrolled along density boundaries in the water column, where temperature and plankton concentrations shifted together. For long stretches, these zones were quiet. An individual ammonite might drift for hours with only the faint shimmer of distant fish or the silhouettes of turtles passing overhead. Then, a sudden concentration of plankton could trigger a brief feeding event, drawing in schooling fish, followed by larger hunters. A single ambush by a mosasaur, a quick burst of acceleration, and a cloud of scales might be the only violent moment in an otherwise uneventful day. How many such encounters left no trace at all? Yet many of the organisms that inhabited this realm ultimately settled into the geological record. When fish, reptiles, or ammonites died in midwater, their bodies sank slowly through the column, sometimes intact, sometimes scavenged along the way. As a result, the fine limestones and shales of the western interior seaway are filled with remains of animals that lived most of their lives in open water, far from shore. These quiet highways of the Cretaceous seas would soon carry their last generations, even as deeper and more distant changes began to reshape the world above and below. Far below those quiet highways of open water, the Cretaceous seas entered another realm. Light thinned, colors drained away, and the familiar blue dimmed into a heavy, permanent twilight. With every additional meter, pressure increased, compressing water, bodies, and even the pace of life itself. In these mid to deep waters, the transition was gradual but relentless. Sunlit plankton swarms gave way to sparse, drifting particles. Temperatures fell and then stabilized, creating cold, uniform layers that changed little from season to season. Over time, this produced an environment where sudden shifts were rare and slow, steady routines dominated. Fish here often carried large eyes and dark, muted pigments. Squid-like cephalopods extended long, sensitive arms into the gloom, tracing faint chemical trails instead of chasing bright silhouettes. Much of the food in this zone arrived from above as a constant, delicate rain. Tiny flakes of organic material, discarded shells, and the occasional sinking jelly formed a dim snow that never stopped falling. This process linked the busy surface to the deep, even though the organisms never met. Because of this connection, many inhabitants were patient scavengers and opportunistic predators, conserving energy and waiting for fragments of the surface world to descend. Fossils from these depths are rarer, so the picture is incomplete. Yet comparisons with modern oceans suggest that slender deepwater fish, small ammonite relatives, and soft-bodied cephalopods occupied these layers. Some may have carried weak bioluminescence, signaling in brief flashes across short distances. Others likely hovered almost motionless, muscles relaxed, rising and sinking with subtle changes in buoyancy rather than active swimming. In a sea ruled near the surface by powerful mosasaurs and swift plesiosaurs, this was a realm where slowness became a survival strategy. At the seafloor, the scene grew quieter still. The bottom of the western interior seaway and the Tethyan basins formed soft, fine sediments, built grain by grain from clay, silt, and the remains of microscopic shells. Here, burrowing invertebrates threaded the mud, ventilating their tunnels and filtering the thin organic film that settled each day. Worms, small crustaceans, and shell-bearing mollusks reshaped the upper layers of sediment, turning the seafloor into a living, shifting carpet. From time to time, larger carcasses reached this deep plain. A dead mosasaur, a plesiosaur, or a giant fish would descend slowly, twisting as trapped gases escaped. When it finally reached the bottom, it became an island of abundance. Scavenging sharks, deepwater fish, and countless invertebrates gathered, stripping flesh, then cartilage, then even the harder tissues. Over time, only a partially buried skeleton remained, ready to be entombed in the accumulating mud. Large marine reptiles could probably dive into these depths, but their visits were brief. Their lungs, metabolism, and hunting strategies were tuned to brighter, richer layers. Here, smaller, slower, and more cryptic organisms held the advantage. Their lives were governed by routine, feeding, burrowing, resting, responding to the gentle rhythm of the organic rain. Even in this distant darkness, far from continents and long removed from direct sunlight, the late Cretaceous seas followed predictable patterns. The deep remained stable while the planet's climate shifted above, while volcanic provinces erupted, and while the last adjustments of sea level reshaped shallow shelves. How could such a steady world be interrupted? The answer would arrive from far beyond the mantle, in a single sudden event that even the deep could not ignore. To see how stable this world appeared, it helps to follow a single day in these late Cretaceous seas. Just before the impact, the western interior seaway and the wider Tethyan oceans moved through a familiar cycle of light and dark, from quiet dawn to calm night, while life responded in predictable ways. At dawn along a broad Cretaceous shoreline, first light filters through warm, shallow nurseries. Sandbars and muddy deltas, formed where rivers meet the sea, break incoming waves and create protected pools. Small fish begin to stir within seagrass beds and reef-like carbonate mounds, rising from the shadowed bottom toward the brightening surface. Above, pterosaurs that spent the night on nearby cliffs open their wings. Some launch into the cool morning air, gliding low over the water to seize fish near the top of the waves. During this time, the boundary between land and sea is busy, but not chaotic. As the sun climbs higher, the view shifts away from the shore and into the mid-waters of the seaway. Here, sunlight penetrates tens of meters, and plankton bloom in dense, drifting layers. Tiny photosynthetic organisms use light and dissolve nutrients, and as a result, they create the base of an abundant food web. Filter-feeding fish and gentle giant sharks move slowly through this haze, straining water through gill structures. Among them, mosasaurs begin their daily patrols, their long bodies and powerful tails adapted to this open realm. Some track schools of fish, others follow the scent of distant carcasses, turning the sunlit middle waters into a three-dimensional hunting ground. By midday, the scene deepens, light fades, temperatures fall slightly, and activity slows in the darker zones below. Fine particles of organic material, shed from plankton and waste above, drift downward as a steady sediment rain. This process builds thick layers of mud and chalk on the seafloor over time. Occasionally, the body of a dead ammonite, a fish, or even a marine reptile sinks rapidly, forming a sudden concentration of food. Deep water invertebrates, small sharks, and scavenging fish gather at these falls, turning brief events into important feasts. Could anything seem more routine than this quiet recycling of life into sediment? Toward evening, attention returns to the shallows. As the sun lowers, turtles rise from feeding grounds to breathe at the surface, their domed shells catching the last orange light. Ammonites adjust their depth with careful control of gas and liquid in their chambered shells, moving to levels where temperature and predators suit the coming night. Near reefs and sandbanks, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs finish their final hunting passes, then sink into slower, energy-saving movements. Because of this daily rhythm, even large predators become part of a broader pattern of rest and motion. Night falls under a clear sky scattered with late Cretaceous stars. The sea surface darkens, but within the upper waters, bioluminescent plankton create faint glows around moving bodies. From above, the seaway appears calm, almost motionless, its tides and waves no different from those of many previous nights in Earth's history. No visible sign marks that this entire system exists on borrowed time. Yet far beyond the atmosphere and crust, an incoming object already crosses space, preparing to interrupt this pattern in a single, irreversible moment. From above, the seaway looks timeless, but on longer scales, it is quietly changing. In the final few million years before impact, Earth does not freeze in place. Climate, currents, and coastlines shift in slow motion, almost unnoticeable from one generation to the next, yet significant when viewed across the planet's late Cretaceous history. During this time, global temperatures remain warm compared with today, but there are hints of gentle cooling in some regions. High latitudes grow slightly less tropical. Seasonal contrasts sharpen on certain continents. Thin bands of oxygen-rich waters expand in a few basins as the upper ocean mixes more deeply. None of this resembles a sudden catastrophe. It is more like a gradual adjustment as the climate system responds to changing plate positions, long-term volcanic gases, and subtle variations in incoming solar energy. Sea level also refuses to stay perfectly fixed. Over time, broad epicontinental seas, such as the Western Interior Seaway that splits North America, experience minor advances and retreats. Shorelines migrate tens of kilometers, then return. Shallow shelves deepen, then infill with sediments carried from the rising interiors of continents. In some intervals, local habitats are lost. In others, new embayments and lagoons are formed along the low coastal plains that rim the seaway. At the same time, ocean circulation patterns reorganize on a global scale, as gateways in the Tethys realm narrow or deepen, and as ridges on the ocean floor continue to rise from mantle heat. currents are redirected. Warm surface waters find new paths. Cooler, denser waters sink in slightly different regions. This process alters where nutrients well up, where oxygen is most abundant, and where plankton blooms are most intense. Because of this, some basins become richer feeding grounds, while others turn more marginal. These slow changes place stress on certain groups. Regional assemblages of ammonites decline in a few areas. Some coral communities shrink as local conditions drift away from their narrow tolerances. Yet the overall picture in the marine fossil record is not one of steady collapse. In many sites, large mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, marine turtles, and diverse fish continue to occupy complex food webs right up to the boundary. The most sensitive record comes from the smallest organisms, in deep-sea cores, and in fine-grained shelf deposits, layers laid down just below the thin KPG clay preserve abundant microfossils. Tiny foraminifera with intricate shells and calcareous nanoplankton coated in plates of carbonate appear diverse and well-fed. Their communities show continuous turnover, but no obvious sign of terminal decline. In many sections, the last pre-impact samples are packed with healthy plankton, indicating that surface waters still support vigorous primary production. As a result, the final 100,000 years do not resemble a world visibly winding down. Instead, they show a dynamic but functioning ocean system, adapting to slow climatic and sea level shifts, much as it had throughout earlier Cretaceous time. The stage is set not for a drawn-out fading, but for a sudden, external interruption. What happens when a relatively stable ocean meets an impact that delivers its energy in minutes, rather than millions of years? The answer will be written first in the sky, then in the seas, as shock, darkness, and acid waters overtake these quietly changing coasts. Yet while the sky prepares its sudden blow, the deep interior of the planet has been working on a different kind of disturbance. Far from these Cretaceous shorelines, on a drifting fragment of crust that will later become part of India, one of the largest volcanic provinces in Earth's history is taking shape. This region is known as the Deccan Traps. During this time, the Indian plate is racing northward over hot mantle. Plumes of rising heat and molten rock reach the base of the crust and begin to melt it. Great cracks open along the surface, and lava pours out in repeated floods, spreading layer upon layer across the land. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these eruptions build a stepped landscape of basalt, eventually covering an area larger than many modern continents. This process does more than add rock to the surface. Each eruptive pulse sends enormous amounts of gas into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide escapes from the magma, while sulfur-rich gases rise and react with water vapor to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. As a result, the climate system is pushed and pulled between warming from greenhouse gases and short-lived cooling from reflective aerosols. How does a marine ecosystem respond when the planet's thermostat is nudged again and again? Over time, the oceans record these distant eruptions in subtle ways. Extra carbon in the atmosphere can dissolve into seawater, shifting its acidity and leaving a signal in the ratios of carbon and oxygen isotopes locked in marine sediments. Sulfur fallout and ash can fertilize surface waters, briefly increasing nutrient supply and changing the balance of plankton species. In some cores from the latest Cretaceous, scientists see turnovers in tiny calcareous plankton, intervals where certain forms decline while others expand. Yet the picture is not one of uniform global collapse before the impact. Many regions show continued productivity, healthy shell-building organisms, and stable food webs right up to the boundary. Some basins record modest shifts in temperature or chemistry, while neighboring areas appear relatively steady. Because of this patchy response, the Deccan Traps are understood less as an immediate killer and more as a persistent environmental stressor. Evidence suggests that volcanism did not proceed at a constant rate. Instead, there were pulses, including major outbursts close to the time of the KPG boundary. Debate continues over how much of the gas release came before the impact and how much followed it. Did earlier pulses gradually strain marine communities, making them more vulnerable when the asteroid struck? Or did the most intense phases arrive only after the biosphere was already reeling? In the late Maastrichtian seas, the result is a quiet tension rather than obvious disaster. Surface waters remain warm, coastlines stay flooded, and large predators still patrol rich midwaters. To the mosasaurs, ammonites, and plankton drifting under calm skies, the distant Deccan eruptions are invisible. Yet in chemical traces and shifting communities, the oceans reveal that the planet is already carrying an extra burden, one that will interact powerfully with the sudden darkness to come. Hidden inside those apparently ordinary waters, the most sensitive recorders of change are not the great reptiles or the ammonites, but tiny drifting organisms measured in fractions of a millimeter. When these plankton die, their hard parts sink and accumulate on the seafloor, forming quiet archives that outlast entire oceans. In the late Cretaceous, this process filled marine sediments with the remains of microfossils, providing a detailed record of conditions in the final stretch before impact. Microfossils include the delicate shells of planktonic foraminifera, tiny single-celled organisms that build chambers of calcium carbonate, and the even smaller plates of coccolithophores, algae that surround themselves with overlapping calcite disks. Together with other microscopic groups, they formed dense clouds in the upper ocean, turning sunlight into organic matter and linking surface ecosystems to the deep sea. Over time, layer after layer of their remains accumulated, compressing into chalks and marls that now form cliffs and outcrops on land. Scientists read these layers the way historians read written records. Changes in which species are present, in how common they are, and in their shell chemistry reflect shifts in temperature, nutrient supply, and ocean acidity. Ratios of oxygen isotopes in foraminifera shells can indicate water temperature and even ice volume on distant continents. Carbon isotopes trace how much organic matter was being produced and buried. Because of this, a thin smear of sediment, only a few centimeters thick, can capture tens of thousands of years of environmental history. Across many late Cretaceous sections, especially in open ocean settings, the story that emerges is one of surprising stability. Microfossil communities remain diverse and abundant, right up to the distinctive thin clay layer that marks the KPG boundary. There is no long, steady collapse in the number of species, no universal decline in shell size, no simple signal of an ocean already emptied of life. To a mosasaur cruising above, the planktonic haze would still appear dense, feeding fish, ammonites, and gentle filter-feeding sharks. However, the record is not identical everywhere. In parts of the western interior seaway and some margins of the Tethys, certain groups of foraminifera begin to decline earlier, replaced by species that tolerate lower oxygen or more variable conditions. In some cores, coccolithophores become less diverse before the boundary clay, hinting at regional changes in nutrients or pH. As a result, it is clear that not all seas experienced the run-up to the extinction in the same way. What might this have meant for local food webs? From the perspective of a large predator or an ammonite drifting near the surface, most regions would still have felt rich and familiar during this time. The water remained clear enough for hunting, the seasonal blooms still arrived, and the deep ocean continued to receive a steady rain of organic particles. Yet within the microfossil layers, subtle shifts and scattered stresses show that the planet's systems were not entirely at rest. The question is how these quiet warning signs would interact with a sudden, catastrophic blow from space. Those quiet warning signs are locked in a different medium than water. To see them clearly, the story must leave the swimming reptiles and rise into the cliffs. In those cliffs, the western interior seaway and other late Cretaceous oceans exist as layered stone, and each layer functions like a page in a diary written by the planet itself. Sedimentary rocks record events because particles settle out of water or air and accumulate on the surface. When this happens year after year, thin beds of mud, silt, and lime build upward, forming a stack that preserves a timeline. The oldest layers rest at the bottom, and younger layers are added on top. Over time, burial, pressure, and minerals from groundwater turn this loose sediment into solid rock, while the remains of organisms become fossils pressed between the pages. In this diary, the Niobrara Formation and the overlying Pierre Shale are long, detailed chapters. During this time, the western interior seaway covered the middle of North America with a broad, shallow inland sea. Fine-grained carbonate mud and later dark marine shales settled slowly through calm water. Because of this, even delicate shells, fish skeletons, and fragile plankton tests reached the seafloor largely undisturbed and were gently buried. This process created rock that still holds paper-thin fish scales, tiny teeth, and undistorted vertebrae of mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. To assign ages to these pages, scientists combine several methods. Biostratigraphy compares the fossils in one layer to those in other regions, using short-lived, widespread species as time markers. Radiometric dating measures the decay of radioactive elements in volcanic ash beds that occasionally fell into the sea and became part of the sediment, giving numerical ages that anchor the relative sequence. Geochemical signatures, such as shifts in carbon or oxygen isotopes, trace changes in climate, ocean circulation, and productivity that can be matched from one continent to another. When this diary approaches the end of the Cretaceous, the pages show unusual markings. Between the uppermost Cretaceous sediments and the earliest Paleogene layers, a razor-thin band of clay appears in many places around the planet. This layer is enriched in iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust, but common in certain meteorites. It also contains shocked minerals and tiny glassy droplets formed by intense heat and pressure. In the otherwise steady sequence of Niobrara and Pierre sediments, this clay stands out like a bold, underlined sentence in an otherwise careful script. What does it mean when a global diary suddenly inserts a sharp, dark line? The combination of precise ages, fossil disappearances, and impact-related minerals points to a single violent event at the KPG boundary. As a result, the calm inland sea that had preserved millions of years of peaceful life is known to have experienced an abrupt break. Now that the method of reading this diary is clear, the narrative can return to the water. The next page to turn is the most dramatic of all. The moment when the impact arrived and the quiet seaway met a burst of energy from beyond Earth. Millions of years before the final day, the asteroid had already begun its silent journey through space. It crossed orbits and passed other worlds, while the late Cretaceous seas remained calm and bright. Gentle waves moved over the western interior seaway, and mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and ammonites swam with no sign that anything had changed. Yet far beyond Earth, a rocky body about 10 kilometers across was locked onto a collision course with the region that would become the Yucatan Peninsula. When the asteroid finally reached Earth, the transition from distant traveler to world-shaping force happened in seconds. It entered the atmosphere at tens of kilometers per second, faster than a rifle bullet, compressing the air in front of it into a mass of white-hot gas. The surrounding sky flashed with blinding light. An instant later, the object struck the shallow sea that covered the Yucatan margin, punching through the water column and into the crust with unimaginable energy. At the moment of impact, rock and water were subjected to pressures and temperatures that rival those in the deep mantle. A vast volume of crust was excavated and hurled outward, forming a crater more than 150 kilometers wide. Seawater near the point of contact did not simply splash, it vaporized, joining vaporized rock in a towering plume. Around the rim, coastlines were scoured clean as shock waves ripped through the ground and through the water above it. In nearby basins and along the edges of the western interior seaway, the seas responded violently. The impact displaced so much water that colossal waves rose and began to race outward. These impact-generated tsunamis moved across the young Gulf of Mexico and into connected seaways, their crests higher than many coastal cliffs. Shallow marine habitats that had formed over time on continental shelves were torn apart as the waves broke, dragging sediment, reef structures, and organisms back into the churning water. Because of this sudden disturbance, environments that had been stable for millions of years were transformed in minutes. Mosasaurs near the surface were hurled against floating debris. Plesiosaurs in quieter embayments found their hunting grounds replaced by turbulent, sediment-laden water. Inland, low-lying coastal plains were overrun as the tsunamis surged far beyond the normal reach of tides and storms. How could such a peaceful seaway absorb so much energy without permanent change? Above the impact site, this process also launched vast quantities of dust, aerosols, and vaporized sulfur into the atmosphere. Fine particles rose high into the sky, spreading around the planet and beginning to block sunlight. Sulfur-bearing gases reacted to form reflective sulfate aerosols, setting the stage for rapid climate disruption. As a result, the initial blast and tsunamis were only the first phase of a much longer global crisis. The asteroid's approach had taken tens of millions of years, but its first lethal effects unfolded in less than a day. Within minutes, light, heat, shock waves, and waves in the ocean reshaped entire regions. In the hours that followed, the atmosphere itself began to change. What would happen to the seas when darkness and cooling spread across Earth's surface? In the first hours after impact, the calm Cretaceous seas near the crater were replaced by motion on a planetary scale. Water was heaved aside as the asteroid struck the shallow shelf of the Gulf of Mexico. A towering wall of displaced ocean raced outward, turning peaceful coasts into corridors of violent flooding. Across the Gulf and into the western interior seaway, tsunamis swept along low-lying margins that had formed when sea level was high. Shallow carbonate platforms, mangrove-fringed bays, and reef-like communities were scoured by high-velocity flows. Sediments were ripped from the seafloor, shells and ammonite tests were tumbled together, and entire coastal ecosystems were smashed against retreating shorelines. In some basins, waves reflected from continental margins and converged, amplifying their height. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and turtles near the surface were hurled landward or buried by collapsing underwater sand avalanches. Farther along the length of the western interior seaway, the disturbance arrived as a complex train of waves. Water levels rose and fell by tens of meters in places, rearranging deltas and barrier islands that had formed over time along the margins of the young continents. This process left chaotic deposits that geologists later traced as evidence of extreme, short-lived energy in what had once been a broad, shallow inland sea. For coastal communities of fish, invertebrates, and marine reptiles, the change was not gradual. It was sudden and lethal. At nearly the same time, another hazard spread across Earth's surface. Superheated ejecta falling back through the atmosphere created an intense pulse of infrared radiation. For a brief interval, the uppermost skin of the ocean and nearby land surfaces absorbed enormous amounts of heat. Coastal forests and vegetation likely ignited, lining the shores of the Gulf and Tethyan margins with fire. The top centimeters of surface water may have warmed dramatically, stressing plankton, delicate larvae, and near-surface swimmers that had no refuge from the radiant energy. Above the planet, vaporized rock and atmospheric gases reacted in the high, hot air. Nitrogen and sulfur from the target rocks and atmosphere combined with oxygen to form nitric and sulfuric acids. Over time, these compounds condensed into tiny droplets and crystals. As a result, acid rain began to fall back toward the oceans and continents, first near the impact region and then more widely. Each storm delivered pulses of acidity to surface waters, altering local chemistry and beginning to dissolve carbonate shells and fragile skeletal material. In deeper offshore zones, the first hours may have seemed quieter. Beyond the reach of the strongest tsunamis and shielded from the most intense surface heating, water masses several hundred meters down remained relatively stable during this time. Yet this apparent safety was temporary. Ejecta particles, soot from burning vegetation, and chemically altered dust slowly settled through the water column, carrying with them the seeds of longer-term change. Because of this, many marine organisms survived the initial onslaught. Burrowing invertebrates, deep-water fish, and some larger reptiles in offshore settings lived through the first day. Their survival, however, led them into a different crisis. As debris continued to fall and chemistry at the surface shifted, the stage was set for a darker, more insidious transformation of the global ocean. What would happen when light itself began to fail and the seas started to cool? As the seas began to cool, another change spread far beyond temperature. In the weeks after the impact, the true agent of crisis was not only falling rock or toxic rain, but the gradual removal of light itself. Across Earth, the sky shifted from bright blue to a dull, ash-laden veil that dimmed even midday. Dust, soot, and tiny droplets of sulfate aerosols rose high into the atmosphere from the impact plume and from global wildfires that swept across the continents. Strong winds carried these particles around the planet, forming a nearly continuous shroud. During this time, sunlight reaching the surface dropped dramatically. Days became twilight. In some regions, for weeks or even months, the sun was little more than a faint disk behind a dirty gray ceiling. In the oceans, this meant that the upper sunlit layer, where most life once gained its energy, changed almost overnight. Phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, and other photosynthetic organisms that floated near the surface could no longer capture enough light to drive photosynthesis. This process, which had powered marine food webs for hundreds of millions of years, faltered. Cells that had divided rapidly now slowed. Many simply died and sank into the darkening depths. As a result, the first victims of the impact winter in the sea were often invisible, yet their loss spread quickly. Zooplankton that grazed on phytoplankton found fewer and fewer cells to consume. Their swarms thinned. Transparent crustaceans, larval ammonites, and filter-feeding invertebrates that depended on constant rain of microscopic plants began to starve. Because of this, the once rich midwaters of the western interior seaway and the Tethys margins grew quieter and more empty. Over time, the collapse moved upward through the food web. Small fish that had fed on zooplankton lost their primary food source. Schools that had once flashed beneath the surface dwindled, leaving gaps in the water column. Larger predators, from swift bony fish to juvenile mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, faced a growing shortage of prey. Even the great marine reptiles that had survived the first shock of the impact now hunted in seas where each successful strike became rarer. Not every community was affected in the same way. Around hydrothermal vents on the deep sea floor, chemosynthetic bacteria used chemical energy from the planet's interior. Rather than sunlight, these ecosystems, fueled by heat and minerals rising from the mantle, likely continued with less disruption. However, they represented only a small fraction of global biomass and could not support the vast open ocean networks that had formed during the late Cretaceous. The longer the atmospheric veil persisted, the more the oceans changed in character. Once productive shelves turned into low-energy environments where carcasses sank and were not quickly replaced. Soundscapes shifted as shoals thinned and hunting chases became less frequent. How long could the last great sea reptiles and their companions endure in a world where the very base of their food chains was disappearing? And what further stresses were still approaching from above and below? In the weeks after the impact, the familiar inland sea is no longer the same bright, fertile basin. The great mosasaur that once patrolled its margins now moves through water that feels heavier and darker, as if the entire column of the sea has dimmed. fine particles hang between surface and seafloor, filtering the light into a brown-green dusk even at shallow depths. This individual has followed old routes that, during this time before the catastrophe, would have been crowded. Usual hunting grounds along a gently sloping shelf once held dense shoals of fish, coiled ammonites rising and falling, and the silhouettes of other reptiles crossing in the distance. Now the mosasaur's broad head passes empty water. It sweeps from side to side, jaws half open, yet only scattered. Nervous fish flash away, rather than forming the thick living clouds that once fed it. Over time, hunger begins to change its movements. The strokes of its tail become slower, the intervals between deep dives longer, and the animal lingers near ledges where currents might concentrate prey. This process is not guided by understanding of any larger event. It is guided only by instinct, by the ache in the gut, and by faint chemical traces of life that are now weak and intermittent. On one long traverse across the basin, the mosasaur encounters another relic of the old community. A long-necked plesiosaur, once a precise hunter of small fish near the surface, now hangs awkwardly in mid-water. Its neck, which used to dart with sudden speed, moves with a tired, uneven rhythm. Ribs show beneath the skin. When the mosasaur approaches, there is a brief tension, a calculation of risk and energy, but both animals are too depleted to chase or flee for long. They drift apart without conflict. Farther along, closer to the center of the seaway, the pattern shifts again. A large turtle, its shell scarred from a lifetime in this inland ocean, labors toward the surface and fails to reach it. The mosasaur passes as the turtle slowly sinks, flippers making small, ineffective circles. Scavenging fish and smaller reptiles circle the body even before it reaches the deeper layers, because of this new scarcity that turns every sinking shape into an opportunity. Here the pattern interrupt is simple yet profound. The sea that once sounded with calls, splashes, and the pressure waves of pursuit is becoming quiet. From the mosasaur's perspective, there is no asteroid, no Deccan volcanism, no understanding of sky or mantle or global climate. There is only a gradual, inexplicable silence replacing the once busy water, and a steady decline in the signals of life that its senses can detect. At last, with energy nearly spent, the animal leaves the familiar shelf and glides downslope into deeper water, where the temperature falls and sound carries differently. It settles near the seafloor, sides rising and falling more slowly, jaws resting on the sediment. Above, the surface is barely visible. From that hidden ceiling, fine ash and organic fragments descend in a continuous drift, like slow gray snow over the last great hunter of this fading sea. The gray snow settles, and with it, an entire way of life begins to pass. In a geological instant, the calm, reptile-ruled seas that seemed so stable are tested. Which creatures endure this sudden darkness, and which are erased from Earth's history forever? When the asteroid strikes and the planet's systems are thrown into crisis, the most famous losses occur on land with the non-avian dinosaurs. In the oceans, however, a different set of giants disappears. Mosasaurs, the dominant marine hunters, vanish completely. Long-necked elasmosaurid plesiosaurs and their shorter-bodied relatives go with them. Coiled ammonites, which had survived earlier crises for hundreds of millions of years, are finally extinguished. Many groups of plankton with calcium carbonate shells also decline or collapse, removing the base of entire food webs. This pattern is not random. Large air-breathing reptiles such as mosasaurs and plesiosaurs depend on high predictable productivity near the surface. They need frequent meals to support their size, and they often specialize on particular prey. When sunlight is blocked, photosynthesis falls, plankton production drops, and prey becomes scarce. As a result, these apex predators and many ammonites, which relied on rich plankton layers and stable chemistry, are among the first marine casualties. In contrast, other lineages pass through the boundary and continue into the early Paleogene seas. Sharks, with their efficient swimming and often flexible diets, survive, even though many individual species vanish. Numerous bony fishes endure as well, from small schooling forms to more solitary hunters. Marine turtles, adapted to long migrations and fasting during nesting cycles, persist. Some marine crocodilians and several plankton lineages, including certain foraminifera and dinoflagellates, also manage to survive and later diversify. Several advantages appear again and again among the survivors. Many are smaller-bodied, requiring less food and able to reproduce more quickly. Others have broad diets, able to switch from one prey type to another as conditions change. Some, such as deep-dwelling fishes or organisms living in turbid coastal zones, already endure low-light, low-food conditions during this time. This process of selection favors organisms that can retreat into refuges, whether in deeper waters, muddy estuaries, or high-latitude seas, less affected by short-term surface changes. The extinction does not unfold in precisely the same way everywhere. In some basins, local communities may linger slightly longer, sheltered by currents or geography. Yet over time, the global signal is unmistakable: a sharp turnover in fossils across the boundary clay, with Cretaceous forms ending abruptly, and new Paleogene assemblages appearing above. Because of this, the late Cretaceous oceans mark a permanent dividing line. The peaceful, reptile-dominated seas, with their great mosasaurs and elegant plesiosaurs, never return. In their place, a new world is formed in which sharks, bony fishes, turtles, and eventually mammals and fully modern lineages rise to prominence. The next chapters of the planet's marine history will unfold in oceans that look familiar, but are ruled by very different heirs to the ancient deep. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, those familiar oceans vanish in everything but name. The same basins remain, but their living fabric is torn apart. Across Earth, the seas become low-diversity refuges, holding scattered survivors rather than dense, interlocking communities. Food webs that once linked plankton, ammonites, marine reptiles, and large fishes contract into simplified chains. Many ecological roles at the surface, in midwater and on the seafloor, stand empty, waiting for new occupants. During this time, the planet's skies are darkened by dust, soot, and sulfur aerosols lifted high above the crust. Sunlight that once drove vast blooms of photosynthetic plankton is sharply reduced. With less light, primary production in the upper ocean drops. As a result, the basic energy supply that had sustained complex Cretaceous food webs nearly collapses. Many surviving animals persist only in sheltered regions, near upwelling zones or coastlines where limited productivity continues. Over time, the atmosphere clears as particles settle back onto the surface and are washed into the oceans. Sunlight begins to return to the water column. This process allows photosynthesis to restart on a larger scale. Tiny cyanobacteria and algae, which had endured in low numbers, start to divide more rapidly. Patchy blooms appear, then spread. Gradually, plankton communities rebuild, restoring the foundation on which more complex marine life depends. Without this quiet resurgence of microscopic organisms, no later recovery would have been possible. Once primary productivity stabilizes, surviving lineages begin to diversify into the vacant niches left by the lost sea reptiles and many Cretaceous invertebrates. Certain bony fishes evolve deeper bodies or new jaw mechanics suited to grazing, crushing, or rapid pursuit. Sharks experiment with different tooth shapes and hunting strategies, from swift open ocean predators to bottom-oriented forms that sift the sediment. Invertebrates such as gastropods, bivalves, and crustaceans radiate across continental shelves, exploring new feeding modes and burrowing behaviors. How does a simplified ocean gradually regain its complexity? It does so through millions of years of small changes that accumulate into entirely new ecosystems. Because of this long interval of experimentation, later Cenozoic seas look familiar, yet fundamentally transformed. Modern coral reefs expand in warm, shallow waters, building intricate three-dimensional habitats that shelter fishes, echinoderms, and countless smaller organisms. Marine mammals, descended from land-dwelling ancestors, return to the oceans and develop streamlined bodies, powerful tails, and complex social behaviors. Whales, dolphins, and seals become important predators and competitors. New apex hunters emerge, including large lamnid sharks and toothed whales that occupy roles once held by mosasaurs and large plesiosaurs. In this way, the disappearance of the last Cretaceous sea monsters marks not the end of ocean life, but the close of one remarkable chapter in the planet's history. The same tectonic forces in the mantle that move continents and reshape basins continue to redirect currents and climates, guiding evolution in the seas above. The oceans that follow are quieter in some respects, yet filled with new forms that would have been unrecognizable to a mosasaur. What kinds of communities develop as these modern lineages mature and spread across the globe? The next phase of Earth's marine story unfolds in fully Cenozoic waters, where ancient legacies and new innovations meet. As the Cenozoic oceans expand into their modern patterns, traces of the vanished Cretaceous seas still shape the planet. The apparent break between those worlds is sharp in time. Yet the water that fills today's basins still moves through spaces first organized when Pangea fractured and long seaways flooded the continents. Many continental shelves now edging the continents were first outlined during this time. When the western interior seaway split North America, when the Tethys Ocean wound between drifting landmasses, sediment began to accumulate along new passive margins. Over time, those margins subsided, widened, and became the broad shelves that now support fisheries, coral reefs, and major coastal cities. The same plate motions that guided mosasaurs through shallow epicontinental seas still pull the crust apart at mid-ocean ridges and drive it down at subduction zones. On land, the quiet cliffs above modern waves hold another legacy. The bright white chalk of southern England, the limestone plateaus of Europe and the Middle East, and thick marine shales in North America were all formed from the remains of Cretaceous plankton and seafloor communities. Tiny calcite plates from coccolithophores, silica skeletons from radiolarians, and the shells of countless small organisms settled through the water column. This process created layer upon layer of mud and ooze that later hardened into rock. Because of this, entire landscapes are built from compressed Cretaceous seas. In many places, a person standing at the base of such cliffs is literally touching ancient oceans. Fossil ammonites, inoceramid clams, and marine reptiles are preserved within these beds, marking food webs that ended abruptly at the KPG boundary. Above them lies a thin, distinctive clay layer enriched in iridium and shocked minerals, a global horizon that records the impact. It is a narrow, physical line separating the age of sea reptiles from the mammal-dominated world that followed. Not all lineages vanished at that boundary. Some sharks, rays, and bony fishes passed through the KPG bottleneck and radiated again in the Cenozoic seas. Certain turtle groups, including marine forms related to modern sea turtles, trace their ancestry back across that divide. Their shells, tooth patterns, and limb structures show deep continuity with late Cretaceous relatives. What does it mean that predators now patrolling continental slopes belong to families that once shared coasts with mosasaurs? When a swimmer enters the modern ocean, the water seems entirely of the present, yet its setting is ancient. Basins are still bounded by margins established as Pangea broke apart. Currents still respond to the arrangement of continents and the depth of gateways first carved in the Mesozoic crust. As a result, the same tectonic and evolutionary framework that hosted plesiosaurs and giant ammonites now supports whales, seabirds, and humans. The story is continuous, and the next chapter asks how life rebuilt the seas from that thin clay horizon upward. From that thin clay boundary, it is possible to step backward in imagination and interrupt the large-scale story with something much smaller. Instead of continents shifting and oceans opening, picture a single swimmer lying face down in the western interior seaway only 100,000 years before the asteroid arrives. The global system is complex, but the local experience is simple. A body suspended in warm, gently moving water. At this time, the seaway stretches across the center of North America, a shallow arm of ocean resting on flooded continental crust. The water is slightly murky, tinted green-brown by plankton and fine sediment carried from distant shorelines. Shafts of sunlight angle down through the haze, fading into a soft, uncertain blue. Below, coiled ammonites hover over the seafloor like living nautilus shells, their chambered bodies reflecting the last filtered light. Farther out, deeper channels fall away into dimmer water where large mosasaurs cruise, their long bodies and paddle-like limbs barely visible shadows in the distance. The swimmer hears almost nothing except the muted rush of waves above and the slow rhythm of breathing through a snorkel. Small fish move in loose schools, silver sides flashing, then vanish into the haze. Now and then, a shadow passes far below, a plesiosaur or marine turtle rising briefly toward the upper layer before sliding back into depth. During this time, the surface seems calm, yet the water column below is a three-dimensional maze of predators, plankton, and drifting shells. Shift suddenly to a modern tropical reef. The same body floats at the surface, but now the water is clear and intensely blue, warmed by sun that has traveled through a thinner, cleaner atmosphere. A rigid framework of corals covers the seafloor, each colony a living crust of polyps building limestone skeletons over time. Reef fish in bright bands of yellow, blue, and red pick at algae and invertebrates. A sea turtle passes within arm's length, followed by a cautious reef shark that turns away with a flick of its tail. The sensory details, however, remain strikingly similar. The gentle lift of buoyancy, the soft push of waves against the body, and the sound of one's own breathing create the same narrow bubble of awareness, yet sunlight still breaks into shifting patterns on the surface. Schools of fish still wheel and turn as single units. Below, in both oceans, there is always a darker layer that the eye cannot fully penetrate. What lies there? The question feels the same. Whether the unseen shape is a mosasaur or a modern whale, yet the cast of characters has changed. In many Cretaceous settings, reef-building corals as known today are patchy or absent, replaced by different communities of sponges, rudists, and microbial mats. Ammonites spiral through midwaters, while marine reptiles dominate the upper levels as air-breathing hunters. Even the microscopic world differs, with other plankton groups shaping watercolor and chemistry. Because of this, the food webs and the exact appearance of the water column are not the same, even if the basic geometry of light, depth, and motion is familiar. This contrast highlights a deeper continuity. Over Earth's long history, oceans have changed their inhabitants many times, yet the experience of being a small air breather in a vast, three-dimensional blue world has remained. This process of replacement and renewal means that later seas inherit the same physical spaces once ruled by ammonites and mosasaurs. As a result, the next step is to leave the surface and descend into that Cretaceous water column, following its residents through their final ordinary days. The Cretaceous water column, with its drifting plankton and cruising reptiles, is only one chapter in a much longer planetary story. Millions of years before those seas formed, Earth had a very different arrangement of land and oceans. How did the planet travel from a molten beginning to a world of supercontinents, inland seaways, and finally the modern map? During its earliest history, the planet lacked stable continents and familiar coastlines. A thin, fragile crust floated over a hotter mantle, broken and recycled again and again. Over time, small cratons survived this intense activity and merged into larger landmasses. Through this process, earlier supercontinents such as Columbia and Rodinia formed, broke apart, and vanished into new configurations, long before Pangea appeared. Pangea itself was another expression of the same deep cycle. It formed as plates collided, closing older oceans and building immense mountain belts. Later, rising mantle heat and stretching crust opened new rifts. As a result, Pangea fractured into separate continents, and broad new ocean basins began to grow between them. Because of this, the Jurassic and Cretaceous eras saw not one central superocean, but a widening network of interconnected seas. By the late Cretaceous, this network included the Tethys Ocean, epicontinental seas spread over low continental interiors, and the Western Interior Seaway that split North America. Warm climates and high sea levels flooded vast areas of shallow crust. These flooded shelves created long sunlit corridors where plankton bloomed, ammonites drifted, and mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and giant fish patrolled the water column. The last great sea monsters were not accidents. They were responses to this particular combination of continents, climate, and depth. Seen from the long view, each generation of marine giants belongs to a specific arrangement of plates and shorelines. Earlier oceans supported trilobites and early fish. Later, different basins favored ichthyosaurs, then mosasaurs, and elasmosaurid plesiosaurs. When continents merge, coastlines shrink and deep oceans dominate. When continents separate, rifted margins, shallow seas, and complex island chains expand habitats again. Life tracks these changes, evolves new forms, and then disappears when the map is redrawn. Modern Earth is simply the current frame in the same sequence. Today's Atlantic opened as Pangea tore apart. The Pacific is shrinking along vast subduction zones. India has already collided with Asia, and new plate boundaries are forming under modern oceans. Future supercontinents will assemble, new inland seas will flood lowlands, and distant descendants of present organisms will adapt to coastlines that do not yet exist. The gentle Cretaceous seaways and today's familiar oceans are two moments in one continuous experiment. Placing present environmental change inside this deep timeline adds perspective, but also urgency. Natural plate motions and climate shifts usually unfold over hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Human-driven warming, habitat loss, and ocean acidification are compressing comparable pressures into centuries. The planet has rebuilt oceans and ecosystems many times, but the rate now is unusual. The next step is to return to those late Cretaceous waters and watch how a thriving sea responds when sudden catastrophe arrives. The late Cretaceous oceans that faced the asteroid were not failing systems. They were among the most productive and structured seas in Earth's history, with layered food webs, diverse habitats, and long-standing lineages. In the Western Interior Seaway, in the Tethys, and on broad continental shelves, daily life continued with regular tides, predictable migrations, and familiar hunting routes almost until the final shock arrived. During this time, background forces still shaped the planet. Continents drifted, mountain belts rose, and sea levels shifted as the crust flexed and subsided. Deccan eruptions released gases and heat from deep within the mantle, and climate trends drifted over hundreds of thousands of years. Yet these changes unfolded slowly enough that plankton, ammonites, mosasaurs, and marine turtles could track new shorelines, adjust ranges, and maintain functioning communities. This contrast between gradual change and sudden impact is central. Tectonics, volcanism, and long-term climate cycles tend to move in steps that life can absorb, even when the steps are large. Populations migrate, evolve, or reorganize. As a result, late Cretaceous seas remained rich and mostly stable, even while subtle pressures accumulated in the background. The asteroid did not strike a world already collapsing. It struck one that was still thriving. However, resilience has limits. Even a robust biosphere can be pushed past a tipping point when the pace and scale of disturbance exceed its built-in buffers. A single impact could inject dust and aerosols into the atmosphere darken the surface, and drive rapid cooling and acidification in the water column. Food webs built over tens of millions of years were suddenly exposed to conditions changing faster than most organisms could track, especially those tied to stable light and temperature regimes. Daily life in those seas did not advertise this risk. Mosasaurs patrolled shelf edges, elasmosaurid plesiosaurs searched quietly for small fish, and ammonites drifted through plankton-rich layers. To these organisms, the main concerns were local: finding prey, avoiding larger predators, navigating currents. How could a hunting mosasaur detect a rock in space already locked on course? How could a filter-feeding shark sense that its plankton base would soon collapse? Because of this disconnect, the late Cretaceous oceans offer a particular kind of perspective. Peaceful routines can coexist with invisible, long-term hazards, whether those hazards originate in orbital dynamics, deep mantle processes, or rapid changes driven at the planet's surface. This process does not erase life's capacity to recover, but it highlights how recovery is selective and slow compared with loss. Over time, Earth has rebuilt marine ecosystems after each crisis, filling empty niches with new lineages and new strategies. Understanding the final Cretaceous seas shows both sides of that record: a biosphere that can endure immense background change, and one that remains vulnerable to rare, abrupt shocks. The next step is to follow that vulnerability into the impact itself and watch how a single day transformed those peaceful waters. To follow that vulnerability into the impact itself, the story moves from open water to solid rock. On a quiet hillside or a road cut, far from any present shoreline, the final moment of the Cretaceous can be seen as a line only a few centimeters thick. Light-colored marine sediments below, lighter Paleogene layers above, and between them, a thin, dark band that marks the end of the last great sea monsters. In many regions, this boundary appears as a gray or chocolate-brown clay, sharply separating chalks and limestones packed with Cretaceous shells from younger beds with a different fossil community. At first glance, it seems unremarkable. Yet detailed study shows that this narrow horizon contains an unusual concentration of iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust, but relatively common in meteorites. During this time, geochemists measured iridium levels tens to hundreds of times higher than normal background values, revealing a signal that pointed away from ordinary volcanic ash or seafloor mud. The same layer also holds grains of shocked quartz, tiny crystals whose internal structure has been deformed by pressures far beyond typical tectonic collisions. Under a microscope, these grains show parallel lamellae that record shock waves racing through the crust in an instant. This process requires energies comparable to nuclear detonations spread over regional scales. As a result, the boundary clay captures, in mineral form, the passage of a vast impact-generated blast through the rocks of the planet. Standing at such an outcrop, it becomes possible to imagine extending a hand and placing fingertips directly on that dark seam. On one side lies the long Cretaceous ocean history, with mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, ammonites, and rich plankton communities recorded in layer after layer. Just millimeters above, those familiar fossils vanish, replaced by smaller, simpler shells and a different set of microfossils. To touch that line is to touch the moment when the last great sea reptiles disappear from the fossil record and the old marine food webs collapse. Above the boundary, early Paleogene sediments tell of silence in the seas. Plankton diversity drops, large predators are absent, and many carbonate deposits give way to clay as surface waters struggle to support the same level of life. Over time, small survivors begin to radiate, filling open niches with new forms of fish, turtles, and marine mammals. Because of this slow rebuilding, the thick stack of younger layers represents recovery rather than simple continuation. This thin band of clay therefore becomes a bridge between abstract, deep time and a personal sense of connection. a handspan on the rock face, spans millions of years below. Yet the boundary itself records events compressed into hours, days, and years. It raises direct questions. How could a single impact reshape entire oceans? And what exactly happened in those first darkened hours after the fireball faded? The next step is to leave the boundary layer and return to that day itself, following the impact from the sky into the seas it transformed. To leave the violence of the boundary layer, the story returns to an earlier night, long before the impact, when the planet's seas were calm. Millions of years ago, under a high late Cretaceous moon, warm water spread across flooded continents. The western interior seaway cut North America in two, and broad arms of the Tethys Ocean reached into shallow basins. From above, Earth's surface would have glowed with scattered blue interiors instead of continuous land. In this imagined night, the viewpoint drifts again just below the surface. Plankton glow in faint pulses, tracing slow currents. A shadow passes overhead, a mosasaur, its long body moving with the smooth rhythm of a modern whale. Flexible ribs and a powerful tail drive it forward as it rises to breathe, then slides back into the dark, following familiar routes along the seaway. During this time, such reptiles were ordinary inhabitants rather than looming catastrophes. Farther out, the long neck of an elasmosaurid plesiosaur bends through the water column. Its small head makes quick, precise turns as it picks fish and cephalopods from the dim light. Flippers sweep in a steady beat, keeping the body almost motionless while the neck explores. Over time, this way of swimming and feeding had become highly efficient, the result of many generations shaped by the quiet demands of finding food rather than surviving a single sudden disaster. Near the seafloor, coiled ammonites rise and fall with their internal chambers, drifting like living spirals among soft sediments. Some flare patterned shells as they move through patches of moonlit water, sharing the space with broad, slow marine turtles that graze or search for invertebrates. Higher in the water, large filter-feeding sharks and bony fish cruise with open mouths, straining dense plankton from the warm, mineral-rich sea. This process turns microscopic life into the massive giants, linking invisible cells to the largest animals in the ocean. All of these organisms share the same basic routines: swimming, feeding, resting, migrating along temperature gradients and coastlines. The asteroid that will end their lineages already moves through space, but for them, it does not exist. For tens of millions of years, days follow nights. Breeding seasons return, young grow and replace the old. Because of this long duration, their true story is one of persistence rather than only of extinction. Modern encounters with the sea still echo this vanished world. Standing on a beach, watching waves roll in over continental shelves, means looking across structures in the crust that once hosted mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. A diver descending through green water, hearing only the muted clicks and distant calls of present-day animals, experiences a soundscape not entirely unlike the late Cretaceous. Ocean life on this planet has changed its cast, but the stage of light, depth, and moving currents remains. Slowly, the imagined Cretaceous night fades. The glow of plankton becomes the reflection of city lights on modern waves, and the silhouettes of extinct reptiles give way to whales and sharks. What does it mean that the same oceans can host such different histories? The answer lies ahead, in connecting these ancient seas to the living oceans that still surround the continents today. The same oceans that once held mosasaurs and glowing plankton now carry ships, cables, and satellites' reflections. This continuity across deep time reveals a central lesson. The seas are never fixed. They are shaped by slow motions of the crust and sudden shocks from space, and life in them is at once remarkably robust and deeply vulnerable. During this time in the late Cretaceous, rising sea levels flooded continents. The western interior seaway split North America, and warm waters spread across much of the planet. Over time, plate movements rearranged basins, opened gateways, and redirected currents. This process controlled where nutrients accumulated, where reefs formed, and where gentle filter feeders or apex predators could thrive. When the asteroid struck, that same interconnectedness carried darkness, acidification, and collapse through almost every marine habitat. The parallels with the modern ocean are striking. Today, the planet is again experiencing rapid climate shifts, changes in ocean chemistry, and widespread loss of biodiversity. However, the drivers are different. Instead of a single impact or a gradual tectonic reorganization, industrial emissions, overfishing, and habitat destruction are altering temperature, circulation, and acidity on timescales that are geologically instantaneous. Because of this speed, many organisms have less time to adapt than their Cretaceous counterparts did between earlier volcanic pulses and sea level swings. In both eras, rising carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere and the seas, and more dissolved CO2 makes surface waters more acidic. In the late Cretaceous, many shelled organisms already lived close to their chemical limits. After the impact, disrupted food webs and changing chemistry helped drive ammonites and many plankton groups to extinction. Today, coral reefs, pteropods, and other shell-forming organisms face similar stresses, but under human-driven rates of change that compress what once took tens of thousands of years into mere centuries. What does that compression mean for the stability of food webs that support modern fisheries and coastal communities? Seen in this longer history, conservation is not just an attempt to freeze nature in place. It becomes a conscious intervention in the next chapter of marine evolution, actions that reduce emissions, protect breeding grounds, or limit pollution influence, which lineages will pass through the present environmental bottleneck and diversify in future oceans. In that sense, modern societies are now one of the main forces shaping how life responds to the planet's ongoing tectonic and climatic background. Paleontology and geology give critical context for these decisions. Fossils and rock layers record how ecosystems responded to earlier disturbances, how long recovery took, and which traits favored survival. They provide baselines for conditions before large-scale human influence and offer cautionary tales about thresholds that, once crossed, led to permanent losses. Far in the future, new observers might read the sediments of today as another sharp boundary. Will they see a thin layer marked by sudden extinctions, plastic fragments, and chemical spikes, or a more gradual transition where many marine communities endured? The answer will define the next great age of the oceans in Earth's history. Far in the future, that question will be answered by silent layers of mud and limestone. In the present, the same planet is still writing its ocean story, grain by grain, along every cliff, riverbank, and shoreline. Millions of years from now, today's beaches and continental shelves will harden into new pages that record changing seas, shifting climates, and the decisions that guided them. To understand this long narrative, it helps to stand where rock meets air. A coastal cliff showing stacked sands and shales, a road cut exposing tilted beds, or a quiet gallery in a local museum all preserve traces of ancient water. During this time in late Cretaceous history, broad epicontinental seas covered large parts of the continents. Their former floors now rise as high plains and chalk downs. Visiting these places connects present-day observers directly to vanished shorelines and to the KPG boundary itself, sometimes visible as a thin, dark band. Local quarries and river gorges often display marine fossils from different intervals of Earth's history. Ammonites, belemnites, and marine reptile bones mark the presence of older oceans, while microfossils in chalk or limestone record the plankton that once filled Cretaceous waters. Over time, this process of looking closely at nearby rocks can turn familiar landscapes into evidence for inland seas, receding shorelines, and long-lost coastlines that shaped regional climate and life. From here, curiosity can move forward and backward in time. After the asteroid, new marine communities formed as mammals returned to the sea and evolved into whales, seals, and manatees. Earlier in the record, other crises reshaped the oceans, such as the end Permian extinction that transformed life long before the last mosasaurs. Looking ahead, plate motions will slowly rearrange the continents again. Future supercontinents and new ocean basins will form as the mantle continues to circulate heat beneath the crust, raising questions about how those seas will differ from both Cretaceous waters and the modern ocean. Engaging with this long perspective also means supporting the work that reveals it. Fossil excavations, core drilling from research vessels, and geochemical studies of ancient sediments all depend on sustained effort. As a result, every new site protected, every sample analyzed, and every marine protected area established becomes part of a continuous attempt to understand and safeguard Earth's oceans, past and present. Because of this, actions that conserve coral reefs, seagrass meadows, and open ocean habitats also serve as a living memorial to worlds that no longer exist. One question remains: which part of Cretaceous sea life would be most compelling to witness directly? The gentle passage of a long-necked plesiosaur through clear, shallow water, the slow drift of ammonite shoals over a chalky seafloor, or the quiet filter feeding of plankton-rich midwaters beneath a calm surface? How does imagining those scenes alter the way modern coasts, estuaries, and offshore zones are perceived? Across all these changes, the ocean itself has remained a single, connected volume encircling the planet. Its basins have widened and closed, its chemistry has shifted, and its inhabitants have risen and fallen. Yet the same global sea has persisted from early magma-heated rains to the present. That continuous ocean invites further questions. What other worlds has it hosted? What futures will it shape? And what new observers will one day read its history in the rocks now forming beneath the waves?